The ground begins trembling before the aircraft appears. At first it feels distant, almost mistaken for weather moving beneath the soil, but the vibration deepens slowly until the metal walls of the temporary barracks begin answering with soft rattles that continue even after the engines themselves pass beyond sight. Southern Italy lies under a pale morning haze. Dust hangs above the roads in thin drifting sheets. Somewhere beyond the olive groves, beyond the shattered rail lines and flattened stone walls, another wave of bombers is already lifting into the air. Their sound arrives long before their shadows. The airfield spreads outward across the countryside like something unfinished and permanent at the same time. Long runways cut through fields that once carried wheat. Fuel trucks move carefully between rows of aircraft painted in faded olive and dull aluminum. Canvas tents stand in uneven clusters near the edge of the base, their surfaces breathing gently in the warm wind. Men walk between them carrying helmets, papers, cups of coffee gone cold before sunrise. Nothing moves quickly. Even urgency here has become measured by repetition. You watch the morning gather itself around the machinery. Ground crews wipe oil from their hands using already darkened cloth. Mechanics disappear beneath bomber wings supported by temporary jacks sunk unevenly into the dirt. A radio crackles somewhere inside a command tent, its voice too distant to fully understand. The smell of fuel settles low over the camp, mixing with dust and damp canvas and the faint sweetness of crushed grass near the perimeter fences. Beyond the runways, church towers remain standing in villages partly broken open by retreating armies and months of occupation. Their bells no longer ring often enough to interrupt the engines. The young men arriving here do not yet understand the scale of what surrounds them. Most carry the last traces of another world still attached to them. Haircuts from training camps back home. Letters folded carefully inside breast pockets. Photographs already beginning to crease along the edges from repeated handling. They step from trucks into heat that feels heavier than expected. Southern Italy does not resemble the Europe many imagined while crossing the Atlantic. The war here feels older. Dust settles into everything. Stone walls lean beside roads cratered by military convoys. Civilians move quietly through nearby towns carrying water or bread beneath skies crowded with aircraft too high to see clearly. One of the boys pauses beside the runway after unloading his duffel bag. He cannot be more than 19. The others continue walking toward the tents, but he remains still for a moment, staring toward the distant horizon where another formation is gathering itself into order. The bombers appear slowly through the haze, enormous and deliberate, sunlight flashing briefly across glass noses and rotating propellers. They rise in layers, one after another, so many that counting them becomes impossible after a few minutes. Until now the war has existed for him mostly through movement. Training bases, transport ships, rail stations, instructions repeated by officers whose names he barely remembers. But here the war no longer feels like movement. It feels rooted, industrial, endless. The machinery does not seem to belong to any single nation or commander anymore. It has become its own environment, its own weather. Around him, nobody watches the bombers for long. Men continue carrying crates. Cigarettes burn between tired fingers. Someone laughs briefly near a maintenance truck before the sound disappears beneath another wave of engines. Familiarity has already altered the atmosphere of the place. The extraordinary survives here only briefly before becoming routine. Aircraft return damaged. New crews arrive. Tents expand farther across the countryside. Fuel continues flowing through hoses dragged across the dirt. Morning briefings repeat themselves beneath hanging lamps while coffee cools untouched beside unfolded maps. You begin noticing how sound governs everything. Engines before dawn. Metal tools striking concrete. Distant anti-aircraft reports carried faintly across the air from somewhere far beyond the Adriatic. Even silence feels temporary here, as though merely waiting for another squadron to begin warming its engines. At night the noise changes rather than disappears. Generators hum beside communication tents. Trucks arrive carrying replacement parts. Men speak more quietly after dark, but sleep itself becomes shallow and uncertain, interrupted by departures scheduled before sunrise. The countryside around Foggia absorbs the war without resisting it. Vineyards stand beside ammunition dumps. Olive trees survive along roads crowded with military traffic. Italian farmers continue moving through nearby fields while bomber formations pass overhead in numbers large enough to cast shifting shadows across entire hillsides. Life continues, though not in the same proportions as before. The machinery has changed the rhythm of the land itself. The boys who arrive here still measure time personally. They count weeks left in deployment. Count letters received from home. Count missions completed. But the airfield measures time differently. Time here is counted in departures, in weather windows, in replacement crews unloaded from transport trucks before dawn. The machinery does not care whether the individual men feel ready for it. It continues expanding outward through repetition alone. And as another formation begins climbing slowly into the whitening sky, the vibration returns once more through the earth beneath the camp, steady and enormous, like something too large now to ever fully stop. Before the next formation disappears into the pale southern sky, stay here a moment longer beside these runways and drifting olive groves, and if these quiet echoes of waiting and endurance still move gently through the darkness with you, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you'd like to return again to these forgotten corners of history. And let us know where you're listening from, or which image stays with you the longest tonight. You're listening to Echoes of War. By late afternoon the heat settles across the airfield in visible layers. Canvas roofs sag slightly between their support poles. Dust clings to damp collars and settles inside boots. The bombers that departed before dawn begin returning one by one through the pale southern light, their shadows sliding across the runways before the aircraft themselves fully emerge from the haze. Some land smoothly. Others arrive unevenly, engines coughing, wheels striking the steel matting harder than intended. Ground crews move toward them almost before the propellers stop turning. Nobody rushes outward dramatically. The reactions here have already been disciplined into procedure. The returning crews descend slowly from the aircraft. Some smile weakly. Others avoid speaking at first, concentrating instead on the ordinary physical tasks that follow survival. Gloves removed. Harnesses unclipped. Helmets carried beneath the arm. Their faces are marked by exhaustion more than excitement. High-altitude flight leaves its own peculiar stillness inside the body. The noise continues echoing long after landing. Men walk across the runway with the unsteady calm of people returning from somewhere emotionally distant. You watch mechanics examining the aircraft before the engines have fully cooled. Fingers trace fresh holes punched through fuselage metal. A tail section hangs partially torn open on one bomber near the edge of the field. Another aircraft returns missing part of its rudder, fabric strips fluttering softly in the wind like torn clothing. The crews who flew inside them speak quietly beneath the wings while officers record details onto clipboards already stained with oil and dust. Nearby, replacement aircraft wait in perfect order, untouched by the day's damage, their surfaces glowing softly beneath the lowering sun. The system leaves little space between survival and continuation. Men who landed safely this afternoon may fly again tomorrow morning. Crews eat dinner while maintenance teams continue working under portable lamps beside the aircraft. Engines are opened. Tires replaced. Fuel hoses dragged once more across the dirt. Somewhere beyond the camp perimeter, church bells ring faintly through the warm evening air, though their sound barely survives against the constant mechanical hum surrounding the airfield. The boys begin learning the geography of the base not through maps, but through repetition. The path toward the mess tent. The shortest route between barracks and briefing room. Which sections of runway flood after rain? Which mechanics can be trusted to speak honestly about damaged aircraft? Even fear develops routines here. Men smoke before missions in the same places each morning. Certain tables inside the mess hall become unofficial territories claimed through habit rather than instruction. Some crews grow quieter before departures. Others speak more loudly than necessary, as though volume itself might hold back uncertainty. Night arrives slowly across southern Italy. The horizon darkens behind rows of parked bombers stretching toward the edge of the countryside. Lanterns flicker outside tents. Cigarette embers drift through the darkness like small moving signals between shadows. Far beyond the airfield, artillery flashes occasionally illuminate distant clouds with soft colorless light. The war continues elsewhere while this enormous machinery pauses briefly to prepare itself for morning. Inside one of the tents, a navigator unfolds a letter already read so many times the paper has become thin at the creases. Around him, other men clean equipment or write hurried replies beneath dim lamps powered by unreliable generators. The atmosphere is strangely domestic despite the scale of destruction surrounding them. Boots dry beside folding cots. Razors scrape quietly against tired faces. Someone murmurs half a song before stopping midway through the tune. Exhaustion softens everything after dark. Yet even here the machinery never fully disappears from awareness. The smell of fuel remains inside the fabric walls. Engines are tested intermittently through the night. Trucks continue arriving from nearby depots carrying ammunition, replacement parts, medical supplies, crates of canned food. Entire systems move continuously behind the visible routines of the crews themselves. Rail workers, drivers, mechanics, signal operators, meteorologists studying cloud formations before dawn. The bombing war requires thousands of ordinary repetitions before a single aircraft leaves the ground. You begin sensing how quickly individuality starts dissolving inside such a system. Not erased completely, only worn thinner through routine. The boys still speak about home during the first weeks. About streets in Brooklyn, farms in Kansas, factories near Detroit rivers darkened by winter smoke. But gradually those places begin feeling farther away than geography alone can explain. The airfield compresses life into narrower rhythms. Wake before dawn. Briefing. Flight. Return. Maintenance. Waiting. Sleep interrupted by engines. Then morning again. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the tents, a mechanic continues tapping metal into place beneath a damaged wing. The sound echoes softly through the warm Italian night. Nearby olive trees move gently in the wind that drifts across the open runways. For a brief moment, the countryside almost resembles peace again. Crickets continue singing beneath the fences. Thin moonlight settles across abandoned stone walls near the edge of the field. But then another engine starts somewhere beyond the darkness, deep and heavy, and the illusion disappears once more. The boys stationed here will later be remembered mostly through statistics. Numbers of sorties, aircraft losses, bomb tonnage, operational ranges across occupied Europe. Yet statistics cannot fully contain the texture of this place. the dust that settled onto every blanket by evening, the strange quiet after aircraft disappeared beyond the horizon, the trembling cups of coffee during engine tests before dawn, the way men learned to study returning formations, counting instinctively without realizing they were counting at all. Because long before many of them understood the war strategically, they understood it physically. Through vibration, through waiting, through repetition, through the slow transformation of ordinary countryside into an endless operational landscape where the sky itself seemed permanently occupied by machinery. The roads into Foggia. The convoys usually arrive before sunrise, while the countryside still belongs partly to mist and silence. Headlights move slowly along damaged Italian roads where retreating armies have left bridges cracked open and culverts half collapsed into shallow streams. Trucks carrying new crews advance carefully through villages darkened by wartime shortages, their engines echoing against stone walls scarred by shell fragments and years of occupation. Sometimes local civilians appear briefly in doorways to watch them pass. A woman holding bread beneath her arm. An old man standing beside a bicycle with one tire worn flat. Children silent in the pale blue light before dawn. Then the convoy disappears again beneath rows of olive trees bending softly in the wind. Inside the trucks, the young airmen sit crowded together among duffel bags and equipment cases. Most have not slept properly since leaving the transport ships. Their uniforms still carry traces of salt from the crossing. Faces drift in and out of shallow sleep as the vehicles jolt over broken pavement. Nobody speaks very loudly anymore. Training camps allowed room for nervous conversation and speculation. Europe feels quieter, heavier. The war has stopped being theoretical somewhere between the Atlantic and these damaged roads winding south toward Foggia. You watch one boy near the back of the truck studying the countryside as it passes. He cannot stop looking at the ruined buildings. A church roof burned away beside a vineyard. A rail station blackened by bombing. Farmhouses standing empty in fields gone partially wild from years of disruption. None of it resembles the clean strategic maps used during training briefings. The war here feels layered into the land itself. Old damage beside fresh repairs. Civilian life continuing carefully inside military geography. The convoy slows near a temporary checkpoint where military police wave vehicles forward beneath hanging lamps powered by portable generators. Beyond the checkpoint, the traffic thickens. Fuel trucks. Ambulances. Flatbed trailers carrying aircraft parts covered beneath canvas sheets. Engineers repairing drainage ditches beside the road. Everything appears caught inside one enormous movement system spreading outward from the airfields. The boys entering it for the first time still believe themselves distinct from the machinery around them. They do not yet understand how completely routine can absorb identity. As dawn begins forming across the horizon, the first bombers become visible in the distance. At first they appear motionless, lined across the flat countryside like dark geometric structures rather than aircraft. Then engines begin starting one after another, and the illusion breaks apart beneath noise and vibration. Thin smoke drifts low across the runways. Floodlights fade gradually against the growing morning light. Ground crews move between aircraft carrying ladders, hoses, ammunition belts, insulated flight gear. The convoy halts briefly beside a drainage canal while another column of vehicles passes toward the main runway complex. Here the boys finally see the scale of the operation clearly for the first time. Airfields stretch outward farther than expected, spread across the plains around Foggia in overlapping networks of temporary infrastructure. Steel matting laid across mud. Tent camps extending toward distant orchards. Fuel depots protected by earth embankments. Rows of bombers waiting in silence before departure. One of the drivers mutters something about the Germans bombing the area months earlier, but the words disappear beneath the sudden roar of engines warming nearby. Conversation stops instinctively. Even men already accustomed to aircraft still react physically when entire bomber formations prepare for takeoff together. The sound does not merely fill the air. It reshapes it. Loose canvas snaps sharply in the prop wash. Dust lifts from the roads in rolling clouds. The trucks themselves vibrate gently where they stand parked beside the canal. The young crews climb down stiffly from the vehicles after hours spent cramped together in darkness and diesel fumes. Boots sink slightly into damp earth near the roadside. Some stretch silently while officers organize papers beneath clipboards illuminated by weak portable lamps. Others stare openly toward the runways where mechanics continue signaling beneath spinning propellers. The bombers seem impossibly large up close. Their wings extend wider than many houses back home. Frost gathers faintly along sections of aluminum skin where cold night air still lingers before sunrise. Nearby, Italian laborists move crates from rail cars onto waiting trucks under the supervision of American quartermasters. The work continues methodically despite the hour. Wooden boxes stamped with ammunition markings. Medical supplies. Replacement radio components. Coffee tins. Blankets. Everything required to sustain thousands of men living beside the airfields flows continuously through these roads before dawn. The bombing campaign depends as much on transport schedules and repaired bridges as it does on pilots or aircraft. You begin noticing how quickly the boys fall silent once surrounded by the machinery itself. Training had prepared them for danger, for technical procedures, for aerial combat described through diagrams and classroom briefings. But preparation had not fully conveyed the atmosphere of industrial war at this scale. The endless movement, the impersonal continuity, the sense that operations continue regardless of whether any single individual fully understands them. An officer finally directs the new arrivals toward their assigned camp sector near the edge of one of the satellite airfields. They walk in loose formation beside muddy roads lined with fuel drums and temporary electrical wires suspended between rough wooden poles. The morning grows brighter with surprising speed. Southern sunlight reveals details hidden moments earlier by darkness. Cratered ground patched repeatedly after previous air raids. Burnt-out vehicles abandoned beside maintenance depots. Laundry hanging between tents despite the military precision surrounding everything else. The camp itself appears less permanent than many expected. Canvas tents arranged unevenly across flattened earth. Narrow walkways reinforced with scrap lumber to prevent men sinking into mud after rain. Small iron stoves positioned outside certain tents for colder nights during winter operations. The boys glance around uncertainly while sergeants distribute bedding assignments and operational instructions delivered in tired voices already worn smooth by repetition. Inside one tent, folding cots stand so close together that personal space survives only through silence and habit. Helmets rest beside footlockers. Damp uniforms hang from improvised ropes tied between support poles. Someone has pinned magazine photographs against the interior canvas wall beside a hand-drawn calendar marking completed missions. The atmosphere carries the smell of wet fabric, cigarette smoke, boot leather, shaving soap, and the faint persistent trace of aviation fuel drifting inward from the runways. The men unpack quietly. A photograph placed carefully beside a cot. A razor stored beneath folded socks. Letters tucked inside metal footlockers already scratched by transport across oceans and rail systems. Around them, the airfield continues awakening into full operational rhythm. Engines rise and fade. Trucks pass beyond the tents carrying ammunition toward loading zones. Somewhere nearby, a cook bangs metal pans together while preparing breakfast for crews scheduled to fly later that morning. Nothing dramatic announces their arrival into the war. No speech. No ceremony. Only gradual absorption into routine already underway long before they appeared here. The machinery does not pause to acknowledge newcomers. It simply continues moving around them, enormous and steady, while southern sunlight spreads slowly across the runways and another day of departures begins. By mid-morning, the camp has already forgotten the moment of their arrival. The new crews move through administrative stations carrying forms that pass from one tired clerk to another beneath hanging tarpaulins erected for shade. Names are checked against operational rosters. Equipment serial numbers recorded. Vaccination papers stamped. The bureaucracy surrounding the bombing war unfolds quietly beside the runways, less visible than the aircraft but no less essential to the machinery itself. Men disappear into systems of documentation almost as quickly as they disappear into the tents. Outside the processing area, the air grows warmer. Southern sunlight settles heavily across the flattened earth around the camp, drawing the smell of fuel and hot metal upward into the still air. Dust clings to damp skin. Somewhere beyond the maintenance depots, a bulldozer pushes earth into fresh embankments beside a fuel storage area expanded only weeks earlier. The landscape around Foggia continues reshaping itself daily beneath the pressure of the air campaign. Fields become runways. Vineyards become truck routes. Quiet countryside becomes infrastructure. You watch the boys attempting to orient themselves inside this new geography. They walk slowly between rows of tents and supply dumps, memorizing landmarks already half obscured by dust and movement. A damaged truck near the mess hall. A cluster of olive trees beside the medical station. A water tower visible from nearly every section of camp. The instinct to map surroundings becomes automatic here. Aircraft can depart at any hour. Air raid sirens may sound unexpectedly. Men learn quickly to navigate by habit rather than conscious thought. Near the edge of the airfield, several bombers stand stripped partially open while mechanics work inside their exposed interiors. Aluminum panels lean against stacks of crates. Oxygen hoses trail through the dirt. One mechanic disappears entirely into an engine housing while another passes tools upward without speaking. The work unfolds with practiced calm. Nobody treats damaged aircraft dramatically anymore. Bullet holes are measured. Parts replaced. Systems tested. Then the bombers return to operation as though destruction itself were merely another maintenance condition. A navigator from one of the older crews pauses beside the newcomers while lighting a cigarette against the wind. His face appears older than the boys expected from someone barely past 25. Sunlight has already bleached sections of his uniform pale around the shoulders. He studies the new arrivals briefly without much expression before gesturing toward the runways. After a while, he says quietly, you stop hearing the engines. Then he walks away before anyone answers. The boys exchange uncertain glances after he leaves. They still hear everything. Every engine test. Every shouted instruction. Every metallic impact from the maintenance zones. Sound dominates the environment so completely that silence itself feels unnatural. Yet the older crews move through the noise almost calmly now, their reactions dulled by repetition and exposure. Adaptation has already altered them in ways difficult to measure from the outside. Lunch arrives without ceremony inside the mess tent. Metal trays slide across long wooden tables stained by coffee and dust. Powdered eggs. Bread hardened slightly by dry air. Lukewarm coffee poured from steel containers dented by constant use. Men eat quickly, not from urgency but from habits shaped by unpredictable schedules. Around them, conversations drift in fragments rather than full exchanges. Weather conditions over the Balkans. Rumors about target assignments. Someone mentioning a crew that failed to return the previous week. The subjects surface briefly before fading beneath other practical concerns. You begin noticing how cautiously emotion circulates through the camp. The war encourages practical speech. Distances. Altitudes. Fuel consumption. Weather fronts moving east across the Adriatic. Men discuss mechanical failure more easily than fear itself. Even homesickness appears disguised beneath ordinary questions about food or seasons back home. The atmosphere rewards emotional compression. Long exposure to operational routine has already taught many of the older crews that open feeling becomes difficult to sustain beside constant departures. After lunch, the heat intensifies further. Activity across the camp slows slightly beneath the weight of the afternoon sun. Some men sleep inside the tents before night missions scheduled later in the week. Others write letters while sitting beneath narrow strips of shade cast by maintenance sheds and fuel trucks. A bombardier from Ohio carefully cleans his flight goggles beside a drainage ditch where frogs continue croaking despite the aircraft noise overhead. Nearby, an Italian laborer repairs a damaged wheelbarrow using wire scavenged from broken fencing. Small ordinary acts continue quietly beside the immense machinery of strategic bombing. The new crews eventually receive permission to walk beyond the immediate camp perimeter during limited hours. A few wander cautiously toward a nearby village partially damaged during earlier fighting. The roads leading there pass beside shattered stone buildings overtaken by weeds and dust. Laundry hangs from surviving balconies. Chickens move through collapsed courtyards. Civilian life persists in fragments among the ruins, adapting itself to military occupation with the same weary practicality seen inside the camps. An old woman stands outside a narrow storefront selling watered wine and bread to passing soldiers. She watches the boys carefully while wiping flour from her hands onto an apron faded nearly white from repeated washing. Language barriers reduce most exchanges to gestures and brief smiles. Yet the boys sense something difficult to define in the civilians surrounding the airfields. Fatigue deeper than exhaustion. The look of people who have already spent years living beside armies moving repeatedly through the same roads and towns. By evening the temperature softens again. Long shadows stretch across the runways while crews scheduled for the next morning gather near briefing tents carrying flight gear and notebooks. The newcomers observe quietly from a distance. They study the older men instinctively now. How they walk. How they prepare equipment. How casually they speak before missions. Experience has become its own form of authority within the camp, separate from official rank. Far across the airfield, another formation begins preparing for departure. Engines start one after another beneath the lowering sun. Mechanics remove wheel chocks. Propellers blur into translucent circles. The familiar vibration spreads once more through the earth beneath the camp, steady enough now that cups rattle softly against mess tables without anyone reacting. The boys stand watching the aircraft taxi toward the runways while dust drifts across the fading light. Somewhere inside them, the final distance between training and reality begins quietly closing. Not through combat. Not through revelation. Only through repeated exposure to the machinery itself. Through routine. Through noise. Through the understanding that tomorrow morning these same roads, these same engines, these same preparations will begin again long before dawn reaches the olive groves surrounding Foggia. Before the engines warm. The airfield belongs to a different kind of silence before dawn. Not true silence. Never true silence. Generators continue humming near the communications tents, and somewhere beyond the darkness mechanics work beneath hooded lamps beside aircraft requiring repairs before morning departure. Yet compared to the violence of daytime operations, these hours feel suspended, as though the machinery itself has lowered its voice temporarily while preparing for another cycle of movement. Cold settles unexpectedly across the plains around Foggia during the final hours before sunrise. Moisture gathers along tent seams and drips slowly onto packed earth below. Men sleeping lightly beneath wool blankets shift restlessly on folding cots while distant engines cough awake one at a time beyond the darkness. The sound travels differently at this hour. Softer at first. More isolated. Each engine distinct before the entire airfield merges once again into one enormous mechanical atmosphere. You watch a sergeant move between the tents carrying a flashlight angled toward the ground. He speaks quietly while waking the crews assigned to the first briefing of the morning. Boots scrape against wooden planks laid over mud. Zippers open. Someone coughs heavily inside the darkness of a canvas shelter, still smelling faintly of damp uniforms and cigarette smoke from the night before. The men rise slowly. No sudden urgency. Experience has already taught them that panic wastes energy long before aircraft ever leave the runway. Inside one tent, a pilot sits motionless on the edge of his cot after waking, elbows resting against his knees while he studies the canvas floor beneath him. Around him the others prepare automatically. Flight boots laced. Jackets pulled over thermal layers. Gloves checked carefully against missing fingers or torn seams. Nobody speaks much during these minutes. The transition from sleep into operational routine requires a certain inward quietness, as though each man must cross some invisible threshold privately before rejoining the machinery outside. The pilot finally reaches beneath his cot and removes a folded photograph from inside his footlocker. A woman standing beside a lake somewhere far from Italy. Pine trees behind her. Snow visible near the shoreline. He studies the image only briefly before placing it back beneath the lid and fastening the lock again. The gesture feels practiced now. Neither dramatic nor sentimental. Simply part of the sequence preceding departure. Outside, the camp begins waking in widening circles of light and sound. Mess crews prepare coffee before sunrise beneath hanging lamps attracting clouds of insects from the surrounding darkness. Ground crews move toward the runways carrying tool cases that strike softly against their legs while they walk. Fuel trucks advance slowly between rows of aircraft, headlights dimmed to narrow yellow slits beneath blackout covers. Overhead the sky remains empty of color, suspended somewhere between night and morning. The boys who arrived only days earlier still react visibly to the atmosphere before missions. Their movements carry uncertainty not yet worn smooth by repetition. One navigator checks his maps twice before leaving the tent despite already confirming them hours earlier. Another crewman repeatedly adjusts the collar of his flight jacket while waiting outside the mess tent holding untouched coffee between both hands. Fear circulates quietly through these moments, though rarely named aloud. The airfield has already taught them that emotion here survives most safely beneath routine. You begin noticing how the older crews conserve themselves before dawn. They move carefully. Speak economically. Energy has become something rationed like fuel or ammunition. Even gestures shrink toward efficiency after enough missions. Cigarettes lit with practiced motions shielded from the wind. Flight logs folded precisely into jacket pockets. Coffee swallowed quickly before cooling in the morning air. Survival depends partly upon this narrowing of unnecessary motion. Near the runways, mechanics continue final inspections beneath portable floodlights casting long white beams across the aircraft. Their shadows move along bomber fuselages in distorted shapes as they climb ladders or disappear beneath wings slick with condensation from the cold night air. One crew chief runs his hand slowly along a section of aluminum patched after the previous mission. The repair appears crude but functional. Most repairs here are functional. There is rarely time for perfection inside continuous operations. Farther beyond the maintenance zones, the countryside remains almost peaceful in darkness. Olive groves shift softly beneath the wind. Farmhouses stand silent beneath fading stars. A dog barks somewhere near the distant village roads before falling quiet again. The contrast feels strange each morning. War machinery occupying landscapes still capable of ordinary stillness. Nature continuing its own rhythms beside systems built entirely around destruction. The crews gather outside the briefing tent shortly before sunrise. Breath drifts faintly in the cold air while officers carry folders and rolled maps beneath their arms. Nobody jokes loudly anymore. Even the younger boys begin sensing that mornings develop their own emotional gravity after enough departures. Men disappear into the briefing tent in small groups, boots leaving shallow impressions in the damp earth outside. Inside, the atmosphere changes immediately. Cigarette smoke hangs beneath the canvas ceiling, illuminated by harsh electric lamps powered through unstable generators. Wooden benches creak softly as crews settle into place holding notebooks and pencils. At the front of the tent, maps cover entire walls. Colored strings stretch across sections of Europe marked with rivers, rail lines, industrial targets, anti-aircraft concentrations. Weather reports sit clipped beside reconnaissance photographs still damp from hurried printing. You watch the crews studying the maps while officers begin speaking in calm, measured voices about altitude, timing, expected resistance, cloud cover over the Balkans or northern Italy. The information arrives methodically. Fuel calculations, emergency procedures, rendezvous coordinates. Casualty probabilities remain mostly unspoken, though everyone understands their silent presence beneath every briefing. For the new boys, this moment still carries traces of anticipation. Missions continue feeling singular to them, defined, distinct. But the older crews already perceive something different beneath the details. Another departure folding into hundreds before it. Another sequence of engines, altitude, weather, tension, return, or failure to return. Repetition has begun reshaping their understanding of time itself. Outside the tent, the eastern horizon finally begins gathering pale silver light above the plains around Foggia. Mechanics remove wheel chocks from aircraft waiting silently across the runways. Coffee cools forgotten beside empty crates. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp perimeter, Italian farmers are already waking beside fields interrupted by military roads and fuel convoys. Another operational morning spreads slowly outward through the countryside while the machinery prepares once more to rise into the sky. When the briefing ends, the men emerge into a world that has changed color while they were inside. Dawn spreads slowly across the plains surrounding Foggia, washing the runways and olive groves in pale grey-blue light that softens every hard edge for a few brief minutes before the full weight of morning arrives. The bombers wait in long silent rows beyond the tents, their surfaces wet with condensation gathered during the night. Ground crews continue moving between them carrying ladders, ammunition belts, oxygen tanks, thermos containers filled with coffee already cooling in the cold air. The crews walk toward their aircraft without speaking much. Briefings create a peculiar quietness afterward. The maps remain inside the mind even while the body continues through familiar motions. Rivers, rail yards, industrial targets hidden somewhere beyond mountains and cloud layers. Men carry these images with them across the airfield while stepping carefully around puddles left by recent rain near the steel runway matting. You watch one bombardier pause briefly beside a drainage ditch before continuing toward his aircraft. Frogs continue calling from the shallow water despite the approaching engine noise. Nearby wild grass bends softly beneath the prop wash from another bomber beginning its warm-up sequence farther down the line. The ordinary world persists stubbornly around the machinery. Birds still move through the trees near the camp perimeter. Mist still gathers low over the fields before sunrise. Yet each morning the war pushes deeper into these landscapes through repetition alone. At the aircraft, routines unfold with practiced precision. Pilots climb into cockpits while mechanics complete final checks beneath the wings. Navigators secure maps against the wind. Gunners inspect ammunition feeds already coated lightly with dust from the roads surrounding the field. Nobody hurries unnecessarily. The crews have learned that rushed movement before takeoff often conceals fear rather than efficiency. Calmness becomes part of the operational discipline itself. The younger boys still glance repeatedly toward the sky while preparing equipment, unconsciously searching for reassurance in weather conditions or visibility. Older crews rarely do this anymore. They understand how little control individual men possess once the engines start and the formations rise northward beyond the Adriatic. Experience narrows attention toward smaller certainties instead. A properly sealed oxygen mask. A functioning intercom wire. A fuel gauge behaving normally during warm-up. Near the edge of the runway complex, several ambulances wait quietly beside the operations tents. Their presence no longer surprises anyone. Drivers lean against the vehicles smoking cigarettes while watching the crews prepare for departure. The ambulances form part of the landscape now, as ordinary as fuel trucks or weather stations. Long exposure to operational routine has absorbed even the possibility of disaster into procedural normality. You begin sensing how much waiting shapes life around the bombers. Waiting before takeoff. Waiting for weather reports. Waiting for aircraft to return across distant horizons hours later. Even motion itself exists mostly between long periods of anticipation. The machinery appears enormous and active from afar, yet individual human experience within it often feels suspended, stretched across repetitive intervals of uncertainty. The first engines reach full power just as sunlight touches the upper sections of the aircraft tails. Propellers blur into pale translucent circles. Heat ripples begin forming behind the exhaust ports, distorting the morning air above the runways. Ground crews step backward, shielding their eyes against dust and debris lifted by the growing vibration. Across the field, more engines awaken one after another until separate sounds merge once again into the familiar continuous roar surrounding Foggia each dawn. Inside the aircraft, the crews settle into positions that will remain largely unchanged for hours. Heavy jackets creak against metal surfaces chilled by the night air. Headsets crackle with fragmented communication checks. Instrument panels glow softly in the dim cockpit interiors while pilots monitor engine temperatures rising gradually toward operational range. Beneath the noise, many men retreat inward during these final moments before movement begins. Thought narrows. Conversation shortens. The machinery demands concentration more than emotion. One young radio operator closes his eyes briefly while the engines vibrate through the fuselage beneath his boots. He had imagined combat differently during training back home. Faster. Clearer somehow. Instead, the war has become dominated by procedure and waiting. Endless preparation surrounding brief periods of terror difficult to describe afterward. Already he senses how repetition threatens to flatten memory itself. One morning blending quietly into the next beneath the same engines and cold dawn light. Outside, Officers standing near the control vehicles signal the first bomber toward the runway. The aircraft begins moving slowly across the steel matting, wheels rattling over uneven sections repaired after previous operations. Others follow behind it in measured sequence, nose lights glowing faintly through the lingering ground mist. From a distance, the bombers resemble enormous migrating animals crossing the plains together beneath the awakening sky. You watch the ground crews remain behind as the aircraft taxi outward. Mechanics stand with hands buried inside jacket pockets against the morning cold. Some instinctively study the engines while the bombers pass, listening for irregular sounds hidden beneath the overwhelming noise. Others simply stare toward the departing formations without visible expression. Their work will continue regardless of whether these aircraft return intact tonight. Repairs already wait beside the maintenance zones. Fuel deliveries continue arriving before noon. Replacement crews remain somewhere behind them on damaged roads moving south through Italy. The first bomber finally reaches the runway threshold and pauses there briefly while sunlight spreads wider across the surrounding fields. For a moment, the entire aircraft seems suspended between stillness and motion. Then the engines surge louder. Dust erupts behind the wheels. The bomber accelerates forward, heavy and deliberate, gathering speed across the runway until the Earth itself appears reluctant to release it. One after another, the others follow. The noise deepens until conversation becomes impossible across the airfield. Bombers rise gradually into the pale southern sky, climbing above olive groves, villages, roads crowded with military traffic. Their shadows slide silently across the countryside below before dissolving into distance. Soon only the vibration remains, lingering faintly through the ground even after the formations themselves have disappeared northward beyond sight. And beneath the widening morning light around Foggia, the camp begins settling once more into the long waiting hours before the aircraft return. The hours between departures and returns. Once the bombers disappear beyond the horizon, the airfield changes temperament completely. The violence of departure fades gradually into distance until only isolated sounds remain scattered across the plains around Foggia. A hammer striking metal somewhere near the maintenance sheds. Trucks shifting gears beside fuel depots. The soft buzzing of field radios inside operations tents where signal operators continue tracking formations already far beyond the Adriatic. After the enormous noise of takeoff, the quiet that follows feels strangely exposed, as though the landscape itself has been emptied too quickly. The men remaining behind settle into routines practiced so often they no longer require conscious attention. Mechanics drag hoses across the runways toward aircraft awaiting repair. Armorous infantry ammunition beneath tarpaulins fluttering in the warm wind. Cooks scrape breakfast trays clean beside barrels filled with grey water and coffee grounds. The machinery of the air campaign never truly pauses. It simply changes rhythm once the bombers leave the ground. You watch the sunlight spread slowly across sections of the airfield still scarred from earlier attacks. Craters repaired hastily with compacted earth remain visible beside newer runway extensions laid over former farmland. The countryside around Foggia carries layers of occupation now. Italian agriculture beneath military infrastructure beneath the constant shadow of strategic bombing. Olive trees survive beside fuel dumps. Shepherd paths intersect roads crowded with transport convoys. Nothing exists entirely outside the war anymore, yet traces of older rhythms continue surfacing quietly through the machinery. Inside the operations tents, officers lean over maps while listening through static-filled radio headphones for position reports transmitted intermittently from the formations. Cigarette smoke hangs low beneath the canvas roofs despite the growing heat outside. Clerks record timings onto sheets already crowded with handwritten corrections and weather notes. The atmosphere inside these tents feels suspended between concentration and waiting. Most of the important work now unfolds far away in skies nobody here can see. The boys new to the airfield struggle most with these waiting hours. During training, war had seemed defined by action, flight, combat, immediate danger. But life around Foggia spends far more time suspended inside uncertainty. The crews who flew out at dawn may return safely this afternoon. They may arrive damaged. They may not return at all. Nothing can be changed from the ground once the formations vanish northward. The waiting becomes its own operational condition. One young mechanic wanders toward the perimeter fence during a break in his work. Beyond the wire, Italian farmers move slowly through nearby fields beneath the strengthening morning sun. A woman bends beside rows of vegetables while a child carries water from a narrow stone well near the road. The mechanic watches them silently for several minutes. Their movements seem impossibly distant from the atmosphere of the airfield despite existing only a few hundred yards away. Back inside the camp, the heat begins rising visibly from the runways by late morning. Dust thickens along the roads between maintenance zones and supply depots. Men loosen jacket collars while continuing repairs beneath aircraft wings hot enough now to burn exposed skin. The Mediterranean climate shifts unpredictably around the operations. Cold dawns followed by crushing afternoons. Sudden rain turning the roads into mud before evening winds dry everything again beneath layers of drifting dust. You begin noticing how repetition slowly reshapes perception here. The older crews no longer mark time through calendars as much as through operational cycles. Missions completed. Aircraft repaired. Weather systems moving east across the Balkans. Even memory starts organizing itself around recurring procedures rather than personal chronology. Weeks collapse together beneath identical dawn briefings and returning formations counted automatically against the horizon. Near noon, a damaged bomber from an earlier mission finally returns unexpectedly to the airfield escorted by 2 fighters. The aircraft approaches low over the surrounding fields, trailing a thin stream of smoke from one engine. Men across the camp stop working almost instinctively to watch its landing. Mechanics emerge from maintenance tents, wiping grease from their hands. Drivers pause beside idling trucks. Even cooks stand briefly outside the mess hall beneath the shade tarpaulins while the crippled bomber circles heavily toward the runway. The landing itself unfolds awkwardly but successfully. One wheel strikes unevenly against the steel matting, causing the aircraft to lurch sharply sideways before correcting. Emergency vehicles move immediately toward it through clouds of dust and exhaust. Yet even this moment, dramatic by ordinary standards, becomes absorbed quickly into procedural calm once the bomber stops rolling. Medical crews assist 2 injured airmen from the fuselage. Mechanics begin inspecting the damaged engine before the propellers fully stop turning. Someone records serial numbers onto a clipboard already stained by oil. The machinery adapts constantly. Damage arrives. Repairs follow. Replacement parts flow inward along the same roads carrying fuel and food and new crews from the ports farther south. The air campaign survives through continuity more than heroism. Individual moments of danger matter less operationally than the ability to continue repeating the system each morning. By early afternoon, many of the men retreat temporarily into whatever shade the camp can offer. Some sleep inside overheated tents despite the flies and distant engine tests continuing across the field. Others sit beside supply crates writing letters home in slow, careful handwriting softened by exhaustion. A navigator describes the Italian weather to his wife without mentioning yesterday's losses. Another crewman spends 20 minutes trying unsuccessfully to explain the scale of the bomber formations using language too small for the reality itself. You watch one of the younger boys unfold a newspaper carried all the way from America weeks earlier through ships and military mail depots. The headlines already belong to another emotional world. Baseball scores, political speeches, advertisements for refrigerators and cigarettes. The paper feels strangely disconnected from the atmosphere surrounding the airfield, as though ordinary civilian life continues somewhere beyond reach, untouched by the operational rhythms consuming the plains around Foggia. The afternoon stretches onward beneath heat and waiting. Somewhere far north of the Adriatic, the bombers continue moving toward targets hidden beyond mountains and cloud layers. Here on the ground, the camp settles deeper into suspended time. Men repair machinery, study weather reports, smoke cigarettes beside fuel drums, listen unconsciously for distant engine sounds that will not arrive for several more hours. And across the countryside, beneath sunlight washing over olive groves and damaged villages alike, the airfield waits patiently for the sky to begin filling once more with returning aircraft. The first sign of the returning formations is usually not visual. It arrives through rumor moving quietly across the camp before the aircraft themselves appear. A radio operator stepping outside the communications tent to relay a fragmented update. A mechanic glancing toward the northern horizon after hearing engines carried faintly through the upper air. Men pause instinctively during their work, listening for confirmation beneath the ordinary noise of the afternoon. By then the sunlight has already begun changing. The hard white glare of midday softens slightly above the plains around Foggia, spreading long pale gold reflections across fuel drums and aluminum fuselages parked beside the runways. Heat still rises from the ground in visible waves. Dust hangs motionless over the roads between the camps and maintenance areas. Yet the atmosphere shifts perceptibly once the possibility of return enters the airfield again. You watch the ground crews begin reorganizing themselves almost automatically. Ambulances reposition closer to the runways. Fire crews check hoses and extinguishers beside their vehicles without needing instruction. Mechanics gather tool cases and replacement parts likely to be needed before evening. Nobody speaks dramatically about the returning bombers. Anticipation here expresses itself through preparation rather than words. Far beyond the olive groves bordering the airfield, tiny shapes finally emerge against the pale northern sky. At first they appear uncertain, nearly invisible through distance and haze. Then the formations clarify gradually into recognizable geometry. Long staggered lines of bombers descending slowly toward the plains of southern Italy. Even after months of continuous operations, many men still stop working briefly to count them. The counting becomes instinctive, quiet, almost unconscious. One formation appears incomplete. Nobody comments immediately. The bombers continue approaching in widening circles above the surrounding countryside while the control towers relay landing instructions through static-filled radios. Sunlight flashes intermittently against cockpit glass and damaged aluminum skin. Several aircraft trail faint smoke. Others descend lower than normal, struggling to maintain formation integrity after the long return flight across occupied Europe and the Adriatic. The waiting hours end not through relief, but through another transition into movement. Engines deepen overhead as the first bombers cross above the perimeter roads where Italian civilians sometimes stop to watch the returns from nearby fields. Children shield their eyes against the sun while studying the aircraft overhead. Farmers pause beside wagons loaded with vegetables or firewood. The war has become part of the atmosphere here. A recurring weather system passing across the same countryside day after day. The first bomber touches down hard enough to send a burst of dust and smoke across the runway edge. Ground crews move immediately into position while the aircraft taxis unevenly toward the dispersal area. Another follows close behind. Then another. Soon the entire airfield fills once more with layered engine noise, shouted instructions, spinning propellers, ambulances weaving carefully between fuel trucks and maintenance vehicles. You begin sensing how little emotional transition exists between danger and routine here. Aircraft returning from anti-aircraft fire over Europe roll directly into repair procedures beside men eating late lunches from metal trays. A crew climbs down exhausted from 8 hours in freezing altitude while mechanics discuss spare engine parts only yards away. The machinery absorbs extremes continuously without pausing to recognize them fully. One bomber near the center runway arrives heavily damaged along its fuselage. Entire sections of aluminum skin have been torn open around the tail. As the aircraft taxis slowly toward the maintenance area, you can see daylight moving through the holes punched across its side. Yet the crew emerging from inside the bomber behave almost quietly. One gunner lights a cigarette before fully reaching the ground. Another removes his gloves carefully while staring absently toward the hills beyond the airfield, as though his thoughts have not yet fully returned with the aircraft itself. Nearby, a younger crew waits watching the returning bombers while preparing for their own scheduled mission the following morning. They study the damaged aircraft with concentrated silence. Nobody openly asks questions. The condition of the returning bombers already contains its own instruction. At the edge of the runway complex, a chaplain walks slowly beside one of the ambulances after medical crews unload an injured radio operator onto a stretcher. The chaplain's presence draws little visible reaction from the men nearby. Religious ritual survives here in subdued forms. Quick prayers before takeoff. Small crosses carried inside flight jackets. Chapel services attended mostly by exhausted men seeking temporary stillness rather than revelation. Even faith begins adapting itself to operational repetition. The returning crews drift gradually back into the camp through late afternoon light. Some head directly toward debriefing tents where intelligence officers record target observations and enemy fighter activity. Others move first toward the mess hall carrying helmets beneath their arms while dust clings to their boots and flight suits. Conversations remain fragmented after missions. Altitudes. Flak concentrations. Weather conditions over the target. Mechanical failures during formation assembly. Men discuss details before meaning. The emotional weight often arrives later, after darkness settles and engines finally stop. One pilot sits alone outside his tent cleaning oil from his hands with a rag already blackened by repeated use. Across the camp, another crew celebrates quietly after completing enough missions to rotate home soon. Their laughter drifts briefly through the evening air before fading beneath the sound of maintenance crews already repairing aircraft for tomorrow's departures. Because the machinery cannot remain still for long. Fuel trucks continue arriving before sunset. Damaged bombers receive temporary patches beneath portable floodlights. Clerks update operational rosters inside tents growing dim beneath evening shadows. New weather reports arrive from stations farther north. Another cycle begins assembling itself almost immediately around the surviving crews. And as the sunlight lowers softly across the plains around Foggia, the boys who arrived believing missions would define the war begin understanding something far larger and quieter instead. The war is not only the bombing. It is the waiting before return. The counting against the horizon. The repaired aircraft. The repeated names on operational rosters. The silence surrounding empty bunks after dark. The machinery continuing calmly into another morning regardless of who comes back changed, or who does not come back at all. Dust, heat, and ordinary hours. By the second week, the boys begin losing their sense of arrival. The roads into Foggia no longer feel new. The tents no longer resemble temporary shelter so much as a fixed condition of life. Even the enormous bomber formations rising before dawn start becoming less startling to the eye. The machinery remains immense, but familiarity has already begun softening the edges of astonishment. This is how adaptation enters the airfield. Quietly. Through repetition rather than realization. The heat deepens steadily as the days pass. Southern sunlight settles over the plains from early morning onward, bleaching canvas roofs and drawing the smell of dust from every road crossing the camps. Men wake already sweating beneath wool blankets dampened by the night air only hours earlier. Water barrels stand beneath shade tarpaulins where long lines form during the afternoons. Flies gather around kitchens and drainage ditches. The entire operational landscape begins carrying the slow, exhausted feeling of continuous exposure. You watch the crews moving more carefully now beneath the sun. Shirts darken with sweat before noon. Mechanics wrap cloth around their necks while working inside engine housings hot enough to burn exposed skin. Pilots scheduled for later missions sleep through the brightest hours with towels draped across their faces to block the heat and flies drifting through the tents. Even conversation slows during the afternoons, reduced to shorter exchanges shaped partly by fatigue. The ordinary hours between missions expand gradually until they occupy more emotional space than the flights themselves. Men shave beside cracked mirrors suspended from tent poles. Socks dry along wires stretched between fuel drums. Someone washes uniforms inside a metal basin beside the medical station while listening absently to aircraft engines warming in the distance. The war increasingly reveals itself through maintenance of daily existence rather than dramatic moments of combat. Near the edge of the camp, an Italian vendor arrives several afternoons each week pushing a wooden cart filled with fruit gathered from nearby orchards untouched by bombing. Oranges. Figs. Small dark grapes still warm from the sun. The crews gather around him carrying cigarettes or ration coupons to trade. Language barriers reduce most exchanges to gestures and repeated phrases half understood by both sides. Yet the routine persists. Small transactions unfolding quietly beside one of the largest air operations in Europe. The vendor's face remains unreadable while the bombers pass overhead. You begin noticing how civilian and military rhythms overlap strangely around Foggia without ever fully merging. Italian women continue carrying baskets through villages shadowed by returning aircraft. Farmers repair stone walls beside roads crowded with transport convoys. Children wave toward bombers climbing overhead while anti-aircraft smoke blooms somewhere far beyond the horizon later that same afternoon. The war occupies the landscape completely, yet ordinary life continues threading itself through the machinery wherever space remains. Inside the tents, the boys develop routines they never imagined during training. One crewman folds every letter from home into exact squares before storing them inside his boot locker. Another sharpens pencils obsessively before each briefing regardless of whether he expects to use them. A tail gunner from Nebraska spends entire evenings repairing a broken wristwatch despite having no real skill with mechanisms. These habits emerge slowly through repetition and waiting, small acts of structure against the vast uncertainty surrounding the airfield. The older crews barely notice such rituals anymore. Experience has already worn their behavior into quieter forms. They know which sections of the camp flood after rain, which cooks save extra bread after late missions, which mechanics can be trusted to speak honestly about damaged aircraft likely to fail again under stress. Survival here depends partly upon learning the informal geography hidden beneath official procedure. One afternoon a dust storm drifts suddenly across the plains from the south, swallowing sections of the airfield beneath thick brown haze. Work continues despite the reduced visibility. Mechanics tie cloth across their mouths while repairing engines. Ground crews shield equipment beneath tarpaulins snapping violently in the wind. Aircraft disappear partially inside clouds of airborne dirt until only spinning propellers remain visible through the haze like pale circular ghosts. You watch the storm alter the emotional atmosphere of the camp almost immediately. Men speak more softly beneath the strange dim light filtering through suspended dust. The horizon disappears entirely beyond the perimeter roads. Even the bombers waiting beside the runways appear transformed, less like machines now and more like buried objects slowly emerging from the earth itself. Inside the operations tents, meteorologists study shifting pressure reports beneath hanging lamps while officers debate whether weather conditions farther north will permit tomorrow's missions. The air campaign depends constantly upon forces impossible to control fully. Clouds over Austria. Wind currents across the Adriatic. Sudden storms rising from the Mediterranean. Human systems stretch themselves across Europe with immense confidence, yet remain vulnerable each day to weather moving silently through the upper atmosphere. By evening, the dust begins settling gradually over the camp. Aluminum wings emerge again beneath layers of brown residue. Men wipe dirt from their faces using already filthy towels. Water becomes temporarily rationed more carefully until new supplies arrive along the convoy routes from the south. The storm leaves everything altered slightly. More exhausted. More worn. And still the machinery continues preparing for morning. The boys start sensing this truth now in quieter moments. The war does not pause for discomfort. Heat becomes routine. Dust becomes routine. Exhaustion becomes routine. Human beings adapt themselves slowly toward conditions they once would have believed impossible to sustain for long. Near sunset, one navigator sits alone beside the perimeter fence watching light settle across the olive groves beyond the airfield. Bombers stand motionless behind him awaiting tomorrow's operations. Somewhere nearby a mechanic taps steadily against damaged metal with a small hammer, shaping repairs that will likely need repeating again within days. The sound drifts outward through the evening air in calm measured rhythm. Not dramatic. Not triumphant. Only continuous. And as darkness begins gathering once more across the plains around Foggia, another operational cycle quietly assembles itself beneath the dust and heat of southern Italy. The evenings bring relief only gradually. Heat stored all day inside the steel runway matting and aluminum fuselages continues radiating outward long after sunset, leaving the camp wrapped in warm stagnant air that smells faintly of fuel, dust, damp canvas, and cooked metal. Men sit outside the tents during these hours because the interiors remain unbearable until deep into the night. Folding chairs appear beside supply crates. Cigarettes glow softly in the dark. Somewhere beyond the maintenance sheds, a radio plays distant American music through static drifting across the airfield like another transmission from home. You watch the crews settling into the slower rhythm that follows the day's operations. Some write letters beneath weak hanging bulbs powered through unreliable generators. Others play cards atop overturned ammunition crates while mosquitoes gather around the lantern light. A few men simply sit silently staring toward the runways where mechanics continue working beneath portable flood lamps. Fatigue expresses itself differently after dark. Less physical now. More inward. The younger boys still speak about returning home as though it exists within visible distance ahead of them. They calculate completed missions carefully. Count remaining months. Debate what food they miss most from home. Yet even during these conversations, uncertainty already shadows the edges of their optimism. Operational life around Foggia stretches time strangely. Weeks repeat themselves so consistently that future plans begin losing clear shape beneath the weight of routine. One bombardier unfolds a map of Michigan beside the tent entrance while explaining lake routes and winter roads to another crewman who has never traveled farther north than Tennessee. The map curls repeatedly in the warm wind blowing through camp. Around them, the airfield hums softly beneath nighttime maintenance work. Generators pulse near the communications tents. Wrenches strike engine housings in distant irregular patterns. Somewhere farther out, trucks continue arriving from the ports carrying ammunition and aviation fuel through roads crowded even after dark. The machinery never fully sleeps. You begin noticing how the older crews protect themselves from exhaustion through emotional economy. They avoid discussing losses directly unless necessary. They rarely speculate aloud about upcoming missions. Some no longer open letters immediately after receiving them, letting the envelopes remain untouched beside their cots for hours or even days. The war has taught them caution toward strong feeling. Emotional exposure becomes dangerous in environments built entirely around repetition and uncertainty. Near the mess hall, several mechanics gather around a barrel filled with water slowly cooling beneath the night air. One washes grease from his forearms while another describes a damaged bomber that returned earlier missing sections of its left wing. The conversation remains technical rather than dramatic. Hydraulic pressure, fuel line rupture, improvised landing procedures. The details matter more here than emotional interpretation. Repetition has trained the men to survive through practical focus. Beyond the perimeter fence, the Italian countryside settles into its own darkness beneath the stars. Farmhouses glow faintly through open windows. Dogs bark along distant roads. Somewhere a church bell marks the hour, though the sound reaches the camp unevenly beneath the constant hum of machinery. The civilians living around Foggia endure the air war differently from the crews stationed here. For them, the bombers are not missions or operational cycles. They are recurring weather passing overhead day after day across the same fields and villages. One evening, rain finally arrives after weeks of dust and heat. At first, the men barely react. Only scattered drops striking canvas roofs and warm aluminum surfaces near the runways. Then the storm deepens rapidly. Wind tears through the camp hard enough to shake entire rows of tents. Rain crashes against the airfield in dense silver sheets illuminated by floodlights and lightning flickering somewhere beyond the plains. The transformation happens almost instantly. Dust becomes mud. Roads collapse into trenches of standing water. Drainage ditches overflow beside the tents. Mechanics run toward exposed equipment beneath flapping tarpaulins while crews scramble to secure loose bedding and clothing before the wind carries them across the camp. You watch the bombers standing motionless beneath the storm, their enormous wings gleaming beneath rainwater and lightning flashes. For a moment, the aircraft appear strangely vulnerable, less like instruments of war and more like abandoned creatures enduring weather beside the olive groves and flooded fields. Inside the tents, the atmosphere changes completely. Men sit awake listening to rain hammer against canvas stretched only inches above their heads. Water drips steadily through weak seams despite hurried repairs made earlier that afternoon. Boots float partially submerged beside folding cots where muddy water seeps inward from beneath the tent walls. Yet even this discomfort becomes absorbed gradually into routine rather than crisis. The crews adapt because adaptation is now the only stable condition available to them. One pilot lies awake watching flashlight beams move outside the canvas while mechanics continue working through the storm near the runways. Tomorrow's missions may still proceed if the weather clears before dawn. If not, the operations will simply shift forward into another day. Delay no longer feels dramatic to the men stationed here. The machinery has taught them patience through repetition. Toward midnight, the rain finally weakens into scattered drops striking puddles across the camp roads. Cool air drifts inward through the tents, carrying the smell of wet earth from the surrounding countryside. Somewhere beyond the darkness, frogs begin calling loudly from flooded drainage canals beside the runways. Nature reasserts itself immediately after the storm, as though waiting only briefly for the machinery to quiet. The men sleep more deeply now beneath the cooler air. Exhaustion settles heavily across the camp after the long day of heat and repair work and disrupted routines. Outside, floodlights reflect softly across standing water pooled beside the aircraft revetments. Mechanics continue moving through the darkness in small groups, checking tie-down cables and inspecting rain-covered engine housings before morning. Because dawn will arrive again soon enough. The roads will fill once more with trucks and fuel convoys. Coffee will steam beneath hanging lamps. Briefings will begin beneath maps dampened by humidity and cigarette smoke. The bombers will warm their engines against the fading darkness. And the plains around Foggia, washed clean briefly by rain, will prepare once more for another day beneath the endless operational sky. The shape of repetition. After enough mornings, the men stop remembering individual departures clearly. Specific missions blur together beneath recurring sequences of sound, movement, weather, and exhaustion until memory itself begins organizing around patterns rather than events. A briefing room lit before dawn. Frost along the aircraft wings during colder mornings. Coffee cooling untouched beside navigation charts. The vibration of engines rising through the earth beneath the camp. Repetition reshapes perception quietly, sanding down the edges separating one operational day from the next. The boys who first arrived staring openly at the bomber formations now move through preparations with practiced rhythm. Helmets carried beneath the arm. Oxygen masks checked automatically before boarding. Flight jackets folded across chairs during briefings in exactly the same manner each morning. Even fear has settled into routine, no longer arriving suddenly but existing instead as a continuous low presence beneath ordinary activity. You watch a navigator standing outside the mess tent before sunrise, smoking alone beside stacked fuel drums wet from overnight condensation. He studies the dark horizon without much expression while aircraft engines begin warming across the field. Weeks earlier he would have been visibly tense before departures. Now his face remains calm. Not because the danger has diminished, but because anticipation itself has become exhausting to sustain indefinitely. The machinery rewards emotional consistency. Men who react intensely every morning eventually wear themselves down faster than the missions alone might require. So adaptation occurs. Expressions flatten slightly. Conversation shortens before takeoff. Emotional reactions delay themselves until privacy becomes available after dark, if they arrive at all. Around the camp, routines continue tightening into fixed operational rhythms. Mechanics wake before the crews they support. Weather officers remain awake through much of the night tracking storm systems drifting across Europe. Cooks prepare breakfast according to departure schedules rather than daylight. Entire lives reorganize themselves around the timing of the bomber formations. One morning thick fog settles unexpectedly across the plains surrounding Foggia before dawn. The runways vanish beneath pale drifting vapor while floodlights glow weakly through the haze like submerged lanterns underwater. Engines continue warming somewhere beyond visibility, their sound carrying strangely through the mist without revealing precise location or distance. Men walk carefully between tents and maintenance zones, following familiar paths nearly invisible beneath the fog. You begin sensing how dependent the airfield has become upon repetition itself. Visibility disappears, yet movement continues. The crews no longer require clear sight to navigate the camp. Their bodies remember the distances automatically. 12 steps from the tent entrance to the drainage trench. 30 more toward the mess hall. Left at the fuel depot. Past the communications tower. Operational geography now exists partly inside muscle memory. Inside the briefing tent, cigarette smoke mingles with fog drifting inward through partially opened canvas flaps. Officers speak quietly over the sound of rainwater still dripping from nearby tents after the previous night's storms. Weather conditions may delay departure, or may not. Men listen without visible frustration. Experience has already taught them that operational certainty rarely survives contact with atmosphere, machinery, or chance. The fog lifts gradually after sunrise, revealing aircraft lined motionless across the wet runways. Water beads along aluminum surfaces reflecting pale morning light. Ground crews emerge from the mist carrying ladders and tool cases while bombers prepare once more for departure. The entire airfield seems to materialize slowly from the weather itself. One of the younger boys pauses while climbing into his aircraft and suddenly realizes he cannot remember whether this is his 7th mission or 8th. The thought unsettles him more than the mission itself. Time is beginning to lose definition here. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Only through repetition so complete that days stop distinguishing themselves clearly from one another. You watch the formations lifting once more through the dissolving fog, heavy bombers climbing slowly into widening sky while their shadows drift faintly across the wet fields surrounding the airfield. Italian farmers stand beside flooded roads watching the aircraft pass overhead exactly as they did yesterday. Fuel convoys continue arriving from the south. Mechanics begin preparing replacement aircraft before the morning formations have even disappeared beyond sight. The machinery operates through anticipation now as much as reaction. Repairs prepared before damage returns. Fuel distributed before shortages occur. Replacement crews assigned before casualties are fully processed through official reports. The system learns to move ahead of loss rather than merely responding to it. Back inside the camp, the waiting hours unfold once again beneath growing heat and lingering dampness from the storm. Laundry hangs between tents, drying slowly in the humid air. Clerks sort casualty paperwork beside stacks of weather reports. A radio operator sleeps in a folding chair outside the communications tent after remaining awake through the night shift monitoring formation signals from the Adriatic. Even rest becomes procedural. One pilot begins shaving each morning at exactly the same time before briefings regardless of mission schedule. Another crewman always folds his blanket twice before leaving the tent even when returning only hours later. Tiny acts of repetition spread through the camp like secondary operational systems layered beneath the official machinery of war. Personal rituals compensating for the enormous unpredictability surrounding everything else. You begin understanding how easily human beings adapt themselves toward endless cycles once repetition becomes the dominant structure of existence. The airfield no longer feels temporary to the men stationed here. It has become a complete environment with its own seasons, habits, emotional rules, and perception of time. And as another operational morning disappears gradually into the distance beyond the Adriatic, the camp settles once more into familiar rhythms already preparing for tomorrow before today has fully ended. The afternoons begin feeling interchangeable first. Sunlight settles across the airfield at nearly the same angle each day, turning the aluminum bombers white beneath the heat while dust rises from the roads in slow drifting curtains behind every passing truck. Men move through familiar routines beneath the same exhausted sky. Mess hall lines forming before late lunches. Mechanics sleeping briefly inside strips of shade beneath aircraft wings. Clerks carrying stacks of paperwork between tents with sleeves rolled above their elbows against the heat. You watch the boys slowly surrendering pieces of individual habit without realizing it fully. Speech patterns shorten. Letters home become more repetitive. Descriptions narrow toward weather, food, sleep, and operational details because the deeper emotional texture of the airfield resists explanation. How do you describe endless recurrence to someone still living inside ordinary civilian time? How do you explain the strange flattening effect of hearing bombers rise every dawn until the sound begins feeling as natural as weather? One tail gunner sits outside the mess tent during the hottest hour of the afternoon, carefully rewriting the same unfinished letter for the third time. Each version begins differently yet arrives at the same problem. Nothing important seems possible to say truthfully anymore. He cannot describe the fear directly because repetition has blurred it into routine. He cannot describe the missions because individual flights already merge together inside memory. Eventually, he folds the unfinished paper and places it back inside his pocket without mailing it. Nearby, mechanics continue replacing damaged engine panels beneath portable tarpaulins that snap sharply in the dry wind moving across the plains. The work proceeds with steady concentration rather than urgency. Repetition has altered their relationship to damage itself. Burned wiring, hydraulic leaks, bullet holes, twisted aluminum skin. All of it now arrives as expected material conditions rather than shocking events. The machinery trains human beings toward procedural acceptance simply by continuing long enough. You begin noticing how the camp measures emotional significance differently over time. Early arrivals reacted strongly to dramatic incidents. Emergency landings, air raid warnings, news of missing crews. But repetition slowly recalibrates perception. What once seemed extraordinary becomes operationally ordinary. Men stop turning toward every engine test. Stop staring openly at damaged bombers returning from missions. Stop asking immediately who failed to return after formation counts come in short. Not because they no longer care. Because sustained reaction becomes impossible inside continuous operations. Near the perimeter roads, Italian workers unload fuel drums from military trucks beneath the supervision of American quartermasters. Their movements remain patient despite the heat. Some of the laborious have worked beside the airfields long enough now to recognize individual crews by sight. Small gestures begin emerging between civilians and airmen. Shared cigarettes. Brief greetings. Fragments of exchanged language assembled awkwardly across cultural distance and wartime necessity. The bombing campaign reshapes civilian life around Foggia almost as completely as it reshapes the crews themselves. Roads built originally for farming carts now support endless military convoys. Fields become emergency landing zones. Water supplies strain beneath the demands of thousands of stationed personnel. Villages adapt themselves to blackout schedules and aircraft noise and unpredictable waves of foreign soldiers moving through the countryside. Yet ordinary life persists stubbornly beside the machinery. One afternoon, church bells drift across the airfield from a nearby village while crews repair bombers damaged over Central Europe earlier that morning. The sound arrives faintly through the heat and engine noise, almost swallowed completely by the operational atmosphere surrounding the runways. Still, several men pause briefly while hearing it. Not because of religion necessarily. More because the bells belong to another rhythm entirely. A reminder that somewhere beyond the bombing schedules and maintenance rosters, older forms of time continue surviving. You watch a young pilot standing beside the perimeter fence afterward, listening until the bells fade back into the distance. For several moments he seems disconnected from the airfield entirely, staring toward olive groves moving softly beneath the wind beyond the military roads. Then another engine starts somewhere near the maintenance area and the spell breaks immediately. He turns and walks back toward the camp without expression. The machinery always reasserts itself. By evening the returning formations once again begin appearing against the northern sky. Men count them automatically now, even while pretending not to. Cigarettes pause halfway toward mouths. Conversations stop briefly beside the maintenance tents. Everyone watches without openly admitting they are watching. This time 2 aircraft are missing from the formation. No announcement follows immediately. The bombers continue landing beneath the lowering sunlight while ambulances reposition quietly beside the runways. Ground crews move into place. Mechanics prepare ladders and replacement parts. The system absorbs absence with disturbing efficiency. Missing aircraft become empty spaces within formation geometry before they become personal loss inside the camp itself. Later, after debriefings finish and darkness settles across the airfield, the missing crews begin circulating through conversation in indirect fragments. Last seen near the target. Engine trouble after flak. Maybe diverted south. Could still land somewhere. The language remains cautious. Hope survives longest through uncertainty. Inside one tent, an unused cot remains perfectly arranged beneath dim lantern light while the crew assigned beside it prepare for sleep without discussing the absence directly. Boots remain positioned carefully below the frame. A photograph still hangs from the support pole beside the blanket. Nothing has physically changed except the silence surrounding the space itself. You begin sensing how repetition gradually transforms even grief into procedural waiting. Men do not fully mourn immediately because the machinery discourages emotional finality too early. Aircraft sometimes return days later. Crews appear unexpectedly from hospitals or alternate landing fields. Official casualty confirmations move slowly through military bureaucracy. So the camp learns to exist temporarily beside uncertainty rather than closure. Outside, the airfield quiets gradually beneath the stars. Generators hum near the communications tents. Mechanics continue working beneath isolated floodlights. Italian night air cools the runways still radiating heat from the day. Somewhere beyond the villages, dogs bark along dark roads carrying fresh convoys north toward the plains around Foggia. And beneath the endless operational sky, another day folds quietly into the next before anyone inside the machinery has fully processed the one already ending. Empty spaces in the formation. The absence becomes visible long before anyone speaks about it directly. At breakfast the following morning, one section of the mess table remains partially empty while trays cool untouched beneath the hanging lamps. Men entering the tent glance toward the space instinctively before looking away again. Conversation continues around it in lowered voices shaped carefully around omission. Weather conditions over northern Italy. Rumors about new aircraft arriving from the ports. Coffee too weak again. Nobody mentions the missing crew immediately, yet the silence surrounding them settles across the camp more heavily than direct acknowledgement might have. Outside, dawn gathers slowly through low drifting clouds moving inland from the Adriatic. Rain during the night has darkened the roads between the tents and runways, turning dust into slick mud that clings heavily to boots. Mechanics move carefully beneath the bombers carrying ladders across ground already marked by fresh tire tracks and standing water. The machinery continues preparing for departure without visible interruption. You watch one of the younger boys pause outside the mess tent holding his coffee while studying the returning aircraft parked near the maintenance area from yesterday's mission. Several still carry visible damage along the fuselage and wings. Temporary repair patches glisten darkly beneath the damp morning light. He finds himself staring at the aircraft longer than necessary now, imagining the empty spaces where other bombers should have landed beside them. Until recently, missing crews existed mostly as abstract operational possibility. Numbers discussed during briefings. Statistical expectations hidden beneath fuel calculations and route diagrams. But repetition changes the emotional distance between men over time. Shared mornings, shared waiting, shared exhaustion. Gradually, the crews become part of one another's environmental reality. Their absence alters the atmosphere physically once they disappear. Near the communications tent, radio operators continue monitoring fragmented transmissions from emergency frequencies across southern Europe. Hope survives procedurally at first. Perhaps an emergency landing in Yugoslavia. A diverted aircraft in Allied territory farther west. A crew rescued after bailing out near the coast. Operational systems delay certainty whenever possible because certainty often arrives carrying finality difficult to absorb inside continuous routine. The older crews understand this already. They avoid asking direct questions. Experience has taught them how slowly confirmation moves through military machinery. Inside the briefing tent, the atmosphere feels subtly changed despite outward normality. Cigarette smoke drifts beneath canvas dampened by humidity while officers review today's routes and target assignments in the same measured voices used every morning. Yet attention fractures more easily now among the younger crews. One navigator studies the maps without fully seeing them. A radio operator taps his pencil repeatedly against the wooden bench until another crewman quietly stills his hand. The machinery demands concentration regardless of emotional condition. Bombers still require fuel. Weather windows still close unpredictably. Targets still wait beyond the mountains and cloud systems north of the Adriatic. Operational continuity leaves little space for pause. You begin noticing how the camp absorbs loss spatially before emotionally. Empty cots. Unused lockers. Flight jackets hanging motionless beside tent entrances after dawn departure times pass. Physical objects remain suspended temporarily between presence and disappearance while bureaucracy catches up with reality. One mechanic enters a maintenance tent searching for spare parts and accidentally finds himself staring at a half-finished letter resting beside a toolbox still belonging to one of the missing crew chiefs. The paper remains exactly where it was left the previous afternoon before the mission. A sentence unfinished midway across the page. Grease fingerprints darkened along the edges. The mechanic studies it briefly before turning away without touching anything. Around the airfield, operations continue expanding outward beneath the growing morning light. Convoys arrive carrying ammunition and replacement fuel drums. Engineers inspect sections of runway weakened by recent storms. Italian laborists repair drainage trenches near the perimeter roads while bombers prepare once again for departure. The machinery responds to absence by increasing movement elsewhere, as though continuity itself offers protection against interruption. You watch the crews boarding aircraft through lingering mist drifting low across the plains around Foggia. The familiar sequences unfold almost unchanged despite the emotional weight pressing quietly beneath them. Flight jackets secured. Intercom wires checked. Engines warming one after another beneath clouds turning pale silver with approaching sunrise. One bomber now occupies the position formerly assigned to a missing aircraft inside yesterday's formation sequence. The substitution appears operationally insignificant. Yet several men notice immediately. This is how attrition enters the airfield at first. Not dramatically. Not through speeches or visible collapse. Through rearrangement. Through replacement. Through small alterations repeated often enough that the camp slowly changes shape around absence without fully acknowledging the transformation while it occurs. The formations begin taxiing toward the runways while ground crews stand beside the muddy roads watching propellers blur against the dim morning sky. Rainwater trembles inside puddles beneath the growing vibration of engines. Somewhere beyond the olive grove surrounding the airfield, Church bells drift faintly across the countryside before disappearing beneath the rising mechanical roar. The boys climb once more into freezing altitude and operational routine because the machinery requires continuation more urgently than reflection. Even grief becomes scheduled around departures and returns here. Emotional processing delayed by fuel calculations, maintenance reports, and tomorrow's briefing times. And as the bombers rise heavily through the damp southern air toward another horizon crowded with uncertainty, the empty places inside the formation travel north with them. The camp grows quieter after losses, though nobody formally instructs it to. Laughter fades earlier in the evenings. Card games break apart sooner. Men linger longer beside the runway edges after returning formations land, studying damaged aircraft while mechanics guide them toward dispersal zones beneath the lowering sunlight. The emotional atmosphere changes gradually, almost invisibly, through hundreds of small behavioral adjustments no single person fully notices while they occur. You watch the crews returning from the morning mission beneath heavy cloud cover drifting south across the plains around Foggia. The bombers descend lower than usual through rough weather over the Adriatic, engines emerging suddenly from grey mist before landing hard against rain-darkened runways. Mud splashes beneath the wheels. Ground crews move carefully through standing water carrying ladders and fuel hoses while ambulances wait beside the operations tents with headlights glowing faintly through drizzle. This time all aircraft return. Yet relief itself feels restrained. The men no longer celebrate survival openly after every successful mission because repetition has complicated the emotional mathematics of the airfield. One crew survives today. Another disappears tomorrow. The machinery discourages dramatic emotional swings simply by continuing too relentlessly for long-term certainty to exist. Near the debriefing tents, crews remove heavy jackets dampened by condensation and rain while intelligence officers record target observations onto forms already crowded with operational details from previous missions. Enemy fighter resistance. Flak concentrations. Cloud formations over rail yards and industrial districts somewhere far north beyond the mountains. The information enters the system quickly, almost clinically. Strategic bombing requires endless conversion of lived experience into procedural data. One young navigator pauses midway through his report after hearing another officer quietly mention the names of the missing crew from yesterday. The names sound strangely fragile spoken aloud. Briefly human again instead of operational. He says nothing afterward for several moments while rain taps softly against the tent roof above them. Then the questioning continues. Altitude. Visibility. Fuel status. Estimated bomb release timing. The machinery always resumes. Outside, mechanics inspect returning aircraft beneath portable floodlights switched on early because of the weather. Water drips steadily from bomber wings onto the muddy ground below. Several planes carry fresh damage along the fuselage where anti-aircraft fragments tore through aluminum skin during the mission. One bomber arrives missing part of its tail stabilizer entirely, the exposed metal bent backward like torn fabric frozen in motion. The crews emerging from inside these aircraft behave calmly now in ways that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. Fear has not disappeared. Instead, it has compressed inward beneath operational habit. Men light cigarettes with trembling hands while discussing fuel consumption. Gunners remove frozen gloves while asking practical questions about tomorrow's departure schedules. Emotional energy narrows towards survival and immediate routine because the larger psychological weight becomes too enormous to carry continuously at full intensity. You begin noticing how attrition changes the camp socially as much as emotionally. Empty spaces at mess tables become filled gradually by replacement crews arriving from the south. New voices appear inside the tents. New habits. New accents from distant American towns nobody else has visited. Yet the replacements enter an atmosphere already shaped by accumulated exhaustion and quiet fear. The older crews study them carefully at first, remembering too clearly their own arrival into the machinery months earlier. One replacement pilot from Oregon laughs loudly during dinner his first evening in camp while describing turbulence during transport flights over the Mediterranean. Several older crewmen glance toward him briefly before returning silently to their meals. Not judgment. Recognition. They remember when war still felt episodic enough to permit spontaneous energy. Repetition alters emotional volume over time. Near sunset, the rain finally stops. Low clouds begin separating slowly above the airfield while weak golden light spreads across puddles gathered beside the runways and maintenance roads. Steam rises faintly from bomber engines still warm after landing. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, Italian children chase one another along muddy village roads while military convoys continue rumbling northward toward the camps. The contrast remains unsettling even now. Ordinary life persists stubbornly beside mechanized destruction. Inside one tent, a crew chief carefully empties the locker belonging to one of the missing airmen after receiving official confirmation earlier that afternoon. The process unfolds quietly beneath dim lantern light. Folded clothing placed into a transport bag. Letters bundled together with string. A photograph removed from the tent support pole where it has hung for weeks unnoticed by most of the men nearby. Nobody assists him. Some tasks inside military life acquire an almost sacred privacy through repetition and loss. You watch the other men inside the tent pretending gently not to observe the process directly. One writes a letter home. Another cleans mud from his boots using a dull knife. A third studies tomorrow's weather reports pinned beside the lantern. Silence here functions partly as respect and partly as self-protection. Every crew understands instinctively how easily any occupied space inside the camp may become empty later. Outside, darkness settles gradually across the plains around Foggia. Floodlights illuminate sections of runway where mechanics continue repairs through the evening. Engines are tested intermittently against the night air, their deep vibrations rolling outward across olive groves and damaged villages already sleeping beneath blackout curtains. The bombing war never fully disappears after sunset. It merely lowers itself into maintenance rhythms while preparing for dawn. The boys now understand something they did not during their first arrival into the airfield. Attrition is not experienced primarily through dramatic catastrophe. It arrives through continuity, through names quietly removed from rosters, through lockers emptied after dark, through replacement crews occupying familiar tents, through the unsettling realization that the machinery absorbs absence almost immediately and continues moving forward with terrifying calm. And beneath the soft rain-washed darkness surrounding the runways, the camp prepares once more for another morning of departures as though nothing essential has changed at all. The men who replaced the missing. The replacement crews usually arrive during the quietest hours of the afternoon, when heat presses most heavily across the plains around Foggia and even the mechanics slow their movements beneath the sun. Trucks appear along the perimeter roads carrying boys whose uniforms still look too clean for the atmosphere waiting beyond the checkpoint barriers. Their duffel bags remain neatly packed. Their boots still carry dust from training bases rather than runway mud and aviation fuel. They step down from the convoy vehicles squinting against the brightness, uncertain where to look first. The older crews always notice them immediately. Not because the replacements behave differently, because they resemble memory itself. You watch one new radio operator standing beside the transport truck after arrival, staring openly toward the runways while a bomber formation circles slowly overhead preparing to land. His expression carries the same mixture of awe and tension once visible on nearly every face entering the airfield for the first time. Nearby mechanics continue repairing damaged aircraft without looking up. Familiarity has already dulled the spectacle for them. The machinery no longer appears extraordinary after enough months inside it. The replacement crews move through the same administrative procedures repeated endlessly by the camp. Names checked against operational assignments. Equipment issued from supply tents smelling of canvas and machine oil. Bedding distributed beside rows of cots recently emptied by missing crews or transferred personnel. Bureaucracy absorbs them quickly into the system before emotion has time to fully form around their arrival. One replacement pilot pauses briefly beside a tent entrance where a faded mission calendar still hangs from the support pole inside. Several names remain penciled beside completed flights. Some marked with small symbols indicating men no longer present. The pilot studies the calendar for only a moment before the sergeant guiding him through camp urges him onward toward his assigned cot. The airfield does not encourage prolonged reflection. Operational continuity depends partly upon controlled emotional momentum. You begin noticing how carefully the older crews interact with the newcomers during these first days. Friendly enough to avoid cruelty. Distant enough to avoid immediate attachment. Attrition has already taught many of the men stationed around Foggia the danger of forming emotional certainty too quickly inside environments built around statistical survival. At dinner, the replacement crews speak more loudly than the others. They still discuss home directly and at length. Baseball teams. Girls left behind. Plans for after the war. Their energy feels slightly out of rhythm with the exhausted atmosphere surrounding the older crews. Yet nobody openly resents them for it. The camp remembers what early arrival felt like. Before repetition flattened emotional extremes into narrower operational patterns. One bombardier from an older crew quietly trades cigarettes with a replacement navigator while explaining how quickly temperatures fall once the bombers climb above the cloud layer. The conversation remains practical. Gloves. Oxygen masks. Keeping pencils warm enough to write during freezing altitude. Around them, the mess hall hums softly beneath hanging lamps, attracting insects from the surrounding darkness. Rainwater still drips occasionally from the tent seams after yesterday's storm. Outside, mechanics continue working beneath portable floodlights despite the late hour. Replacement aircraft have arrived from supply depots farther south during the afternoon. Their aluminum surfaces gleam almost untouched beneath the lamps, strangely clean beside the patched and weathered bombers already worn down by continuous missions. Fresh machinery entering the operational cycle just as fresh crews enter the camps. The parallels remain impossible to ignore. You watch one older pilot studying the replacement aircraft from outside the mess tent while cigarette smoke drifts upward through the warm Italian night. He recognizes the pattern now. New crews. New bombers. New names added quietly onto operational rosters after others disappear. The machinery survives precisely because replacement never stops flowing inward from somewhere beyond the horizon. By morning, the replacements begin learning the geography of the airfield through direct immersion rather than orientation. Muddy paths between tents. Fuel dump locations. Which sections of runway shake hardest beneath heavy departures? Which mechanics tolerate questions and which prefer silence during repairs? Operational life teaches itself through exposure more effectively than formal instruction ever could. One young replacement gunner makes the mistake of staring too long at a bomber returning damaged from an early mission. Entire sections of fuselage have been torn open near the tail by anti-aircraft fragments. The gunner cannot stop studying the holes while ground crews guide the aircraft toward the maintenance area. An older crew chief finally steps beside him without speaking for several moments. "Don't look at the holes," the crew chief says quietly at last. "Look at what's still held together." Then he walks away. The advice lingers with the young gunner long after the conversation ends. Around the airfield, repetition continues, shaping everyone equally regardless of arrival date. Dawn briefings. Waiting hours. Returning formations counted against the horizon. The replacements enter operational rhythms already fully established before they appeared. The machinery does not slow to accommodate inexperience. Adaptation becomes mandatory almost immediately. You begin sensing how attrition alters the emotional structure of the camp, not simply through loss, but through replacement arriving too quickly afterward. Empty spaces rarely remain empty for long around Foggia. New men occupy familiar cots. Fresh handwriting appears beside mission rosters. New voices drift through tents where other voices vanished only days earlier. The system heals operationally before human beings fully process what disappeared. Near sunset, several replacement crews stand watching the evening formations land beneath golden light spreading across the runways and flooded drainage ditches. Bombers descend heavily through warm southern air carrying fresh damage and exhausted crews back from another mission north. The boys observe silently now. Less excitement visible than during arrival. The atmosphere itself has already begun teaching them. This is how adaptation starts. Not through understanding. Through exposure repeated until emotional resistance slowly wears down beneath operational routine and the endless rhythm of departures and returns across the plains around Foggia. The replacements learn fastest at night. Darkness changes the airfield into something quieter and more revealing than daylight operations allow. During the day, the machinery dominates attention through noise and movement and procedural urgency. But after sunset, once the returning bombers settle onto the runways and maintenance crews begin their long repair shifts beneath floodlights, subtler emotional truths emerge between the tents and muddy camp roads. You watch the replacement crews sitting outside their assigned shelters during one unusually cool evening after rain. Lantern light spills weakly across damp ground while distant generators hum near the communications area. Somewhere beyond the runways, frogs continue calling from flooded drainage canals left swollen by recent storms. The atmosphere almost resembles temporary peace if you ignore the aircraft. One replacement pilot asks casually how long the older crews have been stationed around Foggia. Nobody answers immediately. The silence itself becomes instructional. Finally, a tail gunner cleaning mud from his boots mutters, "Long enough," without looking up. Then the conversation drifts elsewhere. The replacements begin understanding gradually that operational life here follows different emotional rules than the training fields back home. Questions about fear rarely receive direct answers. Men avoid discussing the future with too much certainty. Even optimism arrives carefully measured, as though excessive confidence might provoke the machinery surrounding them. Near the maintenance zones, replacement mechanics assist older crew chiefs repairing a bomber damaged over Central Europe earlier that afternoon. Portable floodlights cast sharp white reflections across torn aluminum skin while tools clatter softly against the steel matting beneath their boots. One replacement reaches instinctively toward a jagged section of fuselage pierced by flak fragments before the older mechanic stops him. "Edges stay sharp after impact," the mechanic says quietly. The younger man nods. "Not just about metal." You begin noticing how knowledge transfers through brief practical remarks around the airfield rather than formal mentorship. Older crews rarely lecture openly. Experience has already exhausted unnecessary language from most of them. Instead, instruction arrives through small corrections repeated over time. Keep gloves inside your jacket before altitude. Never trust the first weather report. Sleep whenever possible. Eat before briefings even if nausea makes food difficult. Survival becomes cultural before it becomes strategic. One replacement navigator struggles during his first briefing because the operational maps covering the walls feel overwhelming in scale compared to training exercises back home. Colored strings stretch across entire sections of Europe. Target zones layered beside anti-aircraft concentrations and emergency landing coordinates. The war suddenly appears larger and more impersonal than he imagined while crossing the Atlantic. Afterward, an older navigator quietly helps him fold the maps correctly before departure. "You stop seeing countries after a while," the older man says softly. "Just routes." Outside the briefing tent, dawn light spreads slowly across the plains around Foggia while engines begin warming through lingering ground mist. The replacement crews stand watching the bombers prepare for departure with expressions balanced uneasily between concentration and disbelief. The aircraft still appear enormous to them. Too heavy to rise. Too exposed to survive repeated journeys across occupied Europe. The older crews no longer stare upward during takeoff. They watch the runways instead. You sense how repetition changes the direction of attention itself over time. New arrivals focus on spectacle. Older crews focus on continuity. Fuel leaks. Tire conditions. Delays in departure timing. Whether aircraft maintain proper spacing during formation assembly. Operational life narrows perception toward practical details because emotional survival depends partly upon controlled focus. One replacement gunner vomits quietly beside the runway before his first mission while trying unsuccessfully to hide it from the others. No one mocks him. Several older crewmen simply look away respectfully while mechanics continue preparing the aircraft nearby. Fear remains one of the few conditions around Foggia still universally understood despite all the emotional hardening repetition produces elsewhere. The bomber departs anyway. Later that afternoon, while the replacement crews remain airborne somewhere beyond the Balkans, the older men left behind continue familiar waiting routines beneath heavy southern heat. Cigarettes beneath shade tarpaulins. Repair work beside grounded aircraft. Coffee growing warm inside metal cups untouched for long stretches while radio operators monitor fragmented formation updates drifting through static-filled headphones. You watch one older pilot studying the horizon during these waiting hours with an expression difficult to define. Not hope exactly. Not dread. More like practice suspension between possibilities. He has already learned how dangerous certainty becomes inside operational repetition. When the formations finally return near sunset, the replacement crews descend from their aircraft changed slightly in ways visible even before they speak. Faces more withdrawn. Movements slower. Eyes lingering longer on damaged sections of returning bombers taxiing beside them. Their initiation into the machinery has begun not through dramatic revelation, but through exposure to continuous operational reality. One replacement radio operator sits alone outside his tent after debriefing while dusk settles across the airfield. Around him, the camp moves through familiar evening routines. Mechanics beneath floodlights. Mess hall conversations drifting through open canvas flaps. Trucks arriving with fresh fuel supplies from the south. Yet the boy barely notices any of it. He keeps staring instead at his hands resting motionless against his knees. Hours earlier, those same hands shook violently while anti-aircraft bursts surrounded the formation somewhere above the clouds north of the Adriatic. Now the hands appear calm again. The machinery has already begun teaching him the first essential lesson of operational survival around Foggia. Fear does not disappear. It simply becomes another recurring condition inside the endless rhythm of departure, waiting, return, repair, and continuation beneath the vast southern sky. The weight of the sky. By autumn, the air itself begins changing over the plains around Foggia. Morning cold returns first. Thin frost gathering along the edges of fuel drums before sunrise. Breath visible again outside the briefing tents while mechanics stamp warmth back into their boots beside floodlit aircraft. The heavy southern heat that once settled endlessly across the camps retreats gradually northward, leaving behind colder winds moving inland from the Adriatic and low clouds drifting across the runways before dawn. The men notice the change immediately because weather governs everything here. Cold alters engines. Cold alters altitude. Cold alters the human body itself inside unpressurized bombers climbing mile after mile above Europe. You watch the crews adapting their routines once again. Gloves laid carefully beside helmets before sleep. Extra wool layers drying near tent stoves lit during the coldest mornings. Coffee consumed faster now while still hot. The machinery remains continuous, but the conditions surrounding it shift constantly through season and atmosphere. Near the maintenance areas, mechanics scrape thin ice from bomber wings beneath portable floodlights that throw long shadows across the wet steel matting. Engines resist ignition more stubbornly during colder dawns. Hydraulic systems stiffen overnight. Metal itself seems heavier in the cold. The bombers no longer resemble creatures of sunlight and dust alone. They begin carrying winter inside them now. One replacement navigator from California wakes before briefing and stares silently at frost gathered along the inside of the tent canvas above his cot. Weeks earlier he had still imagined the war episodically, as a sequence of missions leading eventually toward return home. Now operational life feels seasonal instead. Endless. Bound more closely to weather cycles than to any clear sense of progress. You begin sensing how repetition changes the psychological shape of time around the airfield. Early arrivals counted missions. Later they counted weeks. Now many men measure life primarily through environmental conditions. The muddy season. The dust season. The freezing mornings. Human memory reorganizes itself around atmosphere once operational repetition stretches long enough. Inside the briefing tents, maps grow more crowded each month with shifting routes and changing targets farther north into colder regions of Europe. Weather officers speak longer now before missions begin. Wind speeds over mountain ranges. Ice formation risks. Visibility across industrial valleys hidden beneath cloud systems. Strategic bombing depends increasingly upon survival against the sky itself rather than enemy defenses alone. One pilot studies the weather reports more intensely than the target maps during these mornings. Experience has taught him what kills most indiscriminately. Cold. Altitude. Mechanical failure. Weather closing unexpectedly around formations already committed too far north to turn back safely. The machinery continues, rising regardless. You watch the bombers assembling before dawn beneath pale floodlights and drifting mist. Ground crews move between them wrapped in heavy jackets darkened by moisture from the cold air. Engines warm slowly now, coughing smoke into darkness before stabilizing into steady vibration. The entire operational rhythm feels more difficult during winter approach. Movement slower. Hands clumsier inside gloves. Fatigue deeper after nights spent shivering beneath damp blankets inside canvas tents never truly designed for prolonged cold. Yet departures continue with the same procedural calm as before. One morning thick cloud cover hangs low enough that the bombers disappear into whiteness almost immediately after takeoff. Men standing near the runways watch the aircraft vanish one by one only seconds after lifting from the ground. The engines remain audible longer than the planes themselves, muffled strangely inside the cloud layer while vibration spreads outward through the wet earth beneath the camp. Then even the sound disappears. The absence feels heavier during winter weather. You begin noticing how uncertainty expands whenever visibility narrows. Waiting becomes more difficult when the sky itself conceals movement. Radio operators listen harder to static-filled transmissions drifting intermittently across weather systems stretching from Italy into Central Europe. Mechanics study cloud formations while smoking outside maintenance sheds. Crews left behind during operational rotations stare upward more often now despite themselves. Inside one bomber climbing northward through cloud layers, condensation freezes gradually along sections of the fuselage while the crew settles into familiar positions beneath oxygen masks and heavy flight gear. The world outside the aircraft disappears completely. No visible horizon. No ground. Only grey atmospheric emptiness surrounding the formation while engines drone endlessly through freezing altitude. The young replacement radio operator who vomited before his first mission weeks earlier now sits quietly at his equipment station without visible fear. Not because fear has diminished. Because repetition has altered how it exists inside him. Terror no longer arrives sharply before takeoff. Instead, it stretches continuously across the entire operational cycle like background pressure difficult to isolate from ordinary consciousness. This is how the machinery deepens its hold over time. Emotions flatten. Routines harden. The extraordinary becomes environmental. Back on the ground around Foggia, the waiting hours unfold beneath low winter skies darkening by early afternoon. Mud thickens along the roads connecting fuel depots and maintenance zones. Laundry dries slowly in cold damp air carrying the smell of rain and aviation fuel through the camps. Men spend longer inside the mess tents now, lingering beside weak coffee and portable stoves while discussing weather conditions more often than targets or enemy fighters. Because weather has become the true horizon of operational life. One older mechanic quietly tells a replacement crew chief during engine inspection, "The Germans shoot at you. The sky just decides." Neither man laughs afterward. As evening approaches, the cloud ceiling above the plains around Foggia lowers even further while operations officers study delayed formation reports arriving through static and interruption. Somewhere beyond those clouds the bombers continue moving through freezing darkness toward home. And beneath the cold waiting sky, the airfield prepares once more to count the returning formations against the fading light. The weight of the sky. The first returning bombers emerge from the cloud layer just before dusk. Not dramatically. Not all at once. One shape forming gradually through grey mist above the plains around Foggia, followed by another farther west struggling against crosswinds pushing low across the runways. The aircraft appear darker during winter returns, their aluminum surfaces stripped of the bright Mediterranean glare that once reflected from them during summer operations. Ice clings along sections of wing and fuselage where freezing altitude has followed them southward across the mountains and sea. You watch the ground crews moving into position beneath cold drizzle drifting sideways through the evening air. Mechanics pull jackets tighter against the wind while ambulances idle beside the runway edges with headlights glowing softly through mist. Floodlights already burn across the airfield even before full darkness arrives. Winter compresses the operational day now. Morning departures into darkness. Evening returns through darkness. The men begin feeling as though the war itself exists increasingly without sunlight. One bomber lands heavily enough to throw sparks briefly across the wet steel matting before correcting itself against the crosswind. Another circles twice before descending, one engine coughing unevenly through the low cloud cover. The weather strips glamour from the machinery completely during these months. The bombers no longer resemble symbols of strategic power. They look exhausted, burdened, temporary. The crews climbing down from them appear the same. Faces pale from hours spent breathing cold oxygen through masks at altitude. Eyes reddened by wind and fatigue. Hands stiff from freezing temperatures despite gloves and heavy flight gear. One tail gunner nearly slips while descending the ladder from his aircraft because his legs no longer fully respond after the mission. Nearby mechanics catch him gently beneath the arms before he reaches the ground. No one comments on it. The body weakens gradually in these conditions. Everyone understands. Inside the debriefing tents, moisture drips steadily from coats hung near portable stoves struggling to warm the damp canvas interiors. Officers question returning crews while steam rises faintly from wet boots positioned around the stove edges. Conversations move slower during winter evenings. Fatigue deepens beneath cold weather and shortened daylight. Men answer operational questions mechanically while staring absently toward maps pinned against tent walls stained by smoke and humidity. Cloud cover over the target. Flak concentration minimal. Visibility poor during bomb release. One aircraft missing after mountain crossing. The final sentence passes through the tent quietly. Another formation returning incomplete. You begin sensing how attrition changes emotional texture during winter. Earlier losses carried sharp immediate impact because operational life still retained traces of movement and variation beneath Mediterranean heat and long daylight hours. But winter compresses everything inward. Darkness. Cold. Exhaustion. The emotional atmosphere thickens around absence more heavily now because the camp itself has become more enclosed against the weather. One replacement pilot studies the returning crews carefully while waiting outside the debriefing area beneath freezing drizzle. Weeks ago he still viewed the older men with admiration mixed faintly with distance. Now he sees something else emerging beneath the operational routines. Fatigue accumulating slowly year after year through weather, repetition, and uncertainty. Not dramatic collapse. Erosion. Near the maintenance zones, mechanics continue working beneath floodlights despite the worsening conditions. Ice forms along tool handles left briefly exposed. Mud sucks heavily at boots while crews patch damage sustained during missions farther north. One bomber stands partially dismantled beside the runway. Entire engine panels removed while steam rises from exposed components cooling in the cold night air. The aircraft resembles a wounded industrial animal suspended temporarily between operation and failure. The machinery survives through endless repair. So do the men. You watch the camp settling gradually into nighttime rhythms shaped now almost entirely around endurance. Mess hall conversations drift softly through steam-filled interiors smelling of wet wool and weak coffee. Men sleep earlier when missions allow because cold drains energy even during inactivity. Portable stoves glow inside some tents, though fuel shortages prevent continuous heating. Others lie awake beneath blankets listening to winter rain strike the canvas overhead while generators hum endlessly beyond the darkness. One navigator unfolds a map of Europe beside his cot before sleeping and traces tomorrow's likely route northward using only his finger. Mountains. Rivers. Industrial valleys hidden beneath weather fronts drifting east. The operational geography has become intimate to him now in ways impossible months earlier. He knows where turbulence usually forms above certain ridges, which cloud systems conceal anti-aircraft fire, where bombers tend to drift apart during storms crossing the Adriatic. The war has reorganized his perception of the continent completely. Not as nations, not as history, as operational atmosphere. Outside the tents, winter wind moves steadily through the olive groves surrounding the airfield. Floodlights shimmer across puddles gathered beside maintenance roads while trucks continue arriving from the south carrying fuel and replacement parts through freezing darkness. Somewhere beyond the villages surrounding Foggia, civilians sleep beneath blankets while the bomber crews prepare once again for another dawn departure into cloud and altitude and uncertainty. The machinery no longer feels temporary to the men stationed here. It has become climate, season, a complete environment absorbing human life into its recurring rhythms. One older mechanic pauses beside the runway after midnight while cigarette smoke drifts weakly through freezing air around him. Above the airfield, cloud layers move slowly across the hidden stars while distant engines test somewhere beyond the floodlights. He realizes suddenly he cannot remember the last morning that did not begin with aircraft. The thought unsettles him briefly. Then another engine starts in the darkness and the feeling disappears back into routine once more. Because around Foggia, even realization itself survives only temporarily before repetition carries everything forward again beneath the endless operational sky. The mechanical seasons of men. Winter settles fully over the airfields in slow layers. Mud freezes overnight beside the runways and softens again by afternoon beneath weak sunlight that rarely lasts long enough to warm the ground completely. Tent canvas stiffens with frost before dawn. Men wake shivering beneath blankets dampened by condensation gathered during the night. The plains around Foggia lose the bright dusty atmosphere of summer and become something colder, flatter, more exhausted beneath endless cloud systems drifting inland from the Adriatic. The machinery adapts. So do the men. You watch mechanics moving across the frozen steel matting before sunrise carrying lanterns that sway softly through the darkness. Their breath hangs pale in the air while they inspect aircraft coated lightly with ice. Engine oil thickens during cold nights. Fuel lines require careful monitoring. Hydraulic systems respond more slowly in winter temperatures. Every ordinary operational task now demands additional effort from bodies already worn thin by repetition. One ground crewman pauses while scraping frost from a bomber wing and suddenly realizes he has performed this same action so many mornings that the movement now feels older than conscious thought. Hand steady against the metal. Blade angled carefully across the frozen surface. The body continuing through procedure while the mind drifts elsewhere entirely. This is how repetition deepens over time. Not simply into routine. Into instinct. Inside the briefing tents, the atmosphere grows heavier each month as weather delays multiply and casualty reports accumulate quietly through operational paperwork. Portable stoves glow weakly near the map tables while crews sit wrapped in heavy jackets listening to weather officers describe cloud formations stretching across Europe in dense layered systems difficult for bomber navigation. Ice above the Alps. Crosswinds over Austria. Visibility poor near industrial corridors north of the Danube. The sky itself has become another battlefield now. One replacement navigator from New York studies the weather maps with greater concentration than the target diagrams pinned beside them. He has already learned what older crews understand instinctively. Enemy fighters may attack unpredictably. Anti-aircraft fire may intensify or weaken depending on the target. But weather remains indifferent. Unreachable through courage or skill or discipline. Outside, dawn arrives slowly through freezing mist lying low across the plains. Bombers emerge from the darkness piece by piece beneath floodlights and drifting vapor. Engines warm reluctantly in the cold while mechanics stand beside them rubbing numb hands together between checks. The aircraft themselves seem tired now after months of continuous operations. Repaired sections patched over previous damage. Oil stains darkening engine housings. Aluminum surfaces dulled by weather and altitude and constant repair work. The bombers no longer appear invulnerable to anyone stationed here. Not even to the boys newly arriving from the south. You begin noticing how seasonal repetition alters emotional life around the camp. Summer carried exhaustion through heat and dust and endless glaring sunlight. Winter introduces another form of weariness entirely. Darkness arriving early. Damp clothing never fully drying. Missions beginning and ending beneath floodlights rather than natural light. Human beings shrinking inward psychologically while operational routines continue unchanged around them. Near the mess tent, one crew drinks coffee before dawn in complete silence except for spoons striking metal cups. Months earlier such silence would have felt tense or unusual. Now it simply belongs to the operational atmosphere itself. The men no longer require constant conversation to reassure one another. Shared repetition has replaced explanation. One pilot studies the younger replacement crews occasionally during these mornings and recognizes how differently they move now compared to arrival weeks earlier. Shoulders lowered slightly. Faces more withdrawn before takeoff. Cigarettes smoked more quickly beside the runways. The machinery has already begun reshaping them into operational beings rather than civilians temporarily passing through war. Outside the perimeter roads, Italian villages continue enduring winter beneath the shadow of the airfields. Laundry freezes stiff on lines between damaged stone buildings. Farmers move through muddy fields carrying firewood while bomber formations climb overhead into low cloud systems. Children stand beside drainage ditches watching military convoys splash through frozen roads leading toward the camps. Civilian life persists, but increasingly in adaptation to the operational environment surrounding it. The bombing war has become climate for everyone living near Foggia. You watch a chaplain walking slowly between the tents during one freezing evening while light snow begins drifting unexpectedly across the runways. The flakes melt immediately against warm engine housings and muddy roads, disappearing almost as soon as they land. Several men stop briefly to watch them fall. Snow still feels connected to home for many Americans stationed here. Childhood winters. Streets and houses and ordinary seasons untouched by strategic bombing. The memory passes quickly. A mechanic curses softly as wet snow freezes against exposed tools near the maintenance area. Floodlights shimmer through the flakes while crews continue repairing damaged aircraft despite worsening conditions. The machinery does not pause for weather unless forced absolutely beyond operational limits. Even then, the pause feels temporary, merely waiting for another opening in the sky. One older navigator realizes during a late-night debriefing that he can no longer remember the exact sound of civilian silence. Not camp silence. Not operational quiet between departures. Real silence untouched by engines or generators or distant convoys moving through darkness. The recognition unsettles him more deeply than expected. Around Foggia, machinery has replaced nature as the dominant atmosphere. Even dreams now arrive accompanied by engines. You begin sensing how prolonged operational life changes human beings less through trauma than through environmental saturation. The men stationed here do not simply witness mechanized war. They live inside it continuously until ordinary perception reorganizes itself around vibration, weather reports, fuel schedules, formation timing, and the endless anticipation of return. And beneath another freezing dawn gathering slowly across the plains, the bombers prepare once more to rise into cloud and darkness while the men move toward them almost automatically, carried forward by repetition older now than fear itself. Winter settles fully over the airfields in slow layers. Mud freezes overnight beside the runways and softens again by afternoon beneath weak sunlight that rarely lasts long enough to warm the ground completely. Tent canvas stiffens with frost before dawn. Men wake shivering beneath blankets dampened by condensation gathered during the night. The plains around Foggia lose the bright dusty atmosphere of summer and become something colder, flatter, more exhausted beneath endless cloud systems drifting inland from the Adriatic. The machinery adapts. So do the men. You watch mechanics moving across the frozen steel matting before sunrise carrying lanterns that sway softly through the darkness. Their breath hangs pale in the air while they inspect aircraft coated lightly with ice. Engine oil thickens during cold nights. Fuel lines require careful monitoring. Hydraulic systems respond more slowly in winter temperatures. Every ordinary operational task now demands additional effort from bodies already worn thin by repetition. One ground crewman pauses while scraping frost from a bomber wing and suddenly realizes he has performed this same action so many mornings that the movement now feels older than conscious thought. Hand steady against the metal. Blade angled carefully across the frozen surface. The body continuing through procedure while the mind drifts elsewhere entirely. This is how repetition deepens over time. Not simply into routine. Into instinct. Inside the briefing tents, the atmosphere grows heavier each month as weather delays multiply and casualty reports accumulate quietly through operational paperwork. Portable stoves glow weakly near the map tables while crews sit wrapped in heavy jackets listening to weather officers describe cloud formations stretching across Europe in dense layered systems difficult for bomber navigation. Ice above the Alps. Crosswinds over Austria. Visibility poor near industrial corridors north of the Danube. The sky itself has become another battlefield now. One replacement navigator from New York studies the weather maps with greater concentration than the target diagrams pinned beside them. He has already learned what older crews understand instinctively. Enemy fighters may attack unpredictably. Anti-aircraft fire may intensify or weaken depending on the target. But weather remains indifferent. Unreachable through courage or skill or discipline. Outside, dawn arrives slowly through freezing mist lying low across the plains. Bombers emerge from the darkness piece by piece beneath floodlights and drifting vapor. Engines warm reluctantly in the cold while mechanics stand beside them rubbing numb hands together between checks. The aircraft themselves seem tired now after months of continuous operations. Repaired sections patched over previous damage. Oil stains darkening engine housings. Aluminum surfaces dulled by weather and altitude and constant repair work. The bombers no longer appear invulnerable to anyone stationed here. Not even to the boys newly arriving from the south. You begin noticing how seasonal repetition alters emotional life around the camp. Summer carried exhaustion through heat and dust and endless glaring sunlight. Winter introduces another form of weariness entirely. Darkness arriving early. Damp clothing never fully drying. Missions beginning and ending beneath floodlights rather than natural light. Human beings shrinking inward psychologically while operational routines continue unchanged around them. Near the mess tent, one crew drinks coffee before dawn in complete silence except for spoons striking metal cups. Months earlier such silence would have felt tense or unusual. Now it simply belongs to the operational atmosphere itself. The men no longer require constant conversation to reassure one another. Shared repetition has replaced explanation. One pilot studies the younger replacement crews occasionally during these mornings and recognizes how differently they move now compared to arrival weeks earlier. Shoulders lowered slightly. Faces more withdrawn before takeoff. Cigarettes smoked more quickly beside the runways. The machinery has already begun reshaping them into operational beings rather than civilians temporarily passing through war. Outside the perimeter roads, Italian villages continue enduring winter beneath the shadow of the airfields. Laundry freezes stiff on lines between damaged stone buildings. Farmers move through muddy fields carrying firewood while bomber formations climb overhead into low cloud systems. Children stand beside drainage ditches watching military convoys splash through frozen roads leading toward the camps. Civilian life persists, but increasingly in adaptation to the operational environment surrounding it. The bombing war has become climate for everyone living near Foggia. You watch a chaplain walking slowly between the tents during one freezing evening while light snow begins drifting unexpectedly across the runways. The flakes melt immediately against warm engine housings and muddy roads, disappearing almost as soon as they land. Several men stop briefly to watch them fall. Snow still feels connected to home for many Americans stationed here. Childhood winters. Streets and houses and ordinary seasons untouched by strategic bombing. The memory passes quickly. A mechanic curses softly as wet snow freezes against exposed tools near the maintenance area. Floodlights shimmer through the flakes while crews continue repairing damaged aircraft despite worsening conditions. The machinery does not pause for weather unless forced absolutely beyond operational limits. Even then, the pause feels temporary, merely waiting for another opening in the sky. One older navigator realizes during a late-night debriefing that he can no longer remember the exact sound of civilian silence. Not camp silence. Not operational quiet between departures. Real silence untouched by engines or generators or distant convoys moving through darkness. The recognition unsettles him more deeply than expected. Around Foggia, machinery has replaced nature as the dominant atmosphere. Even dreams now arrive accompanied by engines. You begin sensing how prolonged operational life changes human beings less through trauma than through environmental saturation. The men stationed here do not simply witness mechanized war. They live inside it continuously until ordinary perception reorganizes itself around vibration, weather reports, fuel schedules, formation timing, and the endless anticipation of return. And beneath another freezing dawn gathering slowly across the plains, the bombers prepare once more to rise into cloud and darkness while the men move toward them almost automatically, carried forward by repetition older now than fear itself. The machinery continues without witness. By the final winter months, the airfield no longer feels temporary to anyone living inside it. The tents have settled deeper into the mud after endless rain and cold. Walkways repaired dozens of times now sag unevenly beneath boots and transport carts. Bombers arrive and disappear through weather so continuously that even memory begins losing clear boundaries between specific missions. The machinery has outlived novelty entirely. It exists now as permanent atmosphere stretching across the plains around Foggia like climate itself. You watch the men moving through dawn preparations beneath freezing drizzle and weak floodlights, their bodies carrying routines older now than many of their conscious thoughts. Helmets lifted automatically from hooks beside tent entrances. Coffee swallowed without tasting it. Flight gloves warmed briefly against engine housings before boarding. Repetition has settled into muscle and instinct and nervous system until operational life unfolds almost independently of emotion. One replacement pilot, no longer truly a replacement after months of missions, wakes before the morning briefing and suddenly realizes he cannot remember his last uninterrupted day without aircraft. Not combat. Not fear. Aircraft. Engines. Fuel. Vibration. Weather reports. The endless anticipation of departure and return. The machinery has become the background structure beneath every waking thought. Outside, fog drifts low across the runways while mechanics inspect aircraft coated with freezing moisture from the night. Bombers stand beneath floodlights like exhausted industrial monuments, patched repeatedly across wings and fuselage where months of operations have torn and repaired them over and over again. Some planes now carry layers of replacement metal from so many previous missions that little untouched surface remains visible. The crews resemble them more each week. Fatigue repaired temporarily. Emotional damage patched over. Continuation valued more highly than restoration. You begin noticing how operational life eventually strips even dramatic experience of narrative shape. New arrivals once imagined war as a sequence of events leading toward climax or conclusion. But prolonged repetition dissolves that structure completely. Missions blur into seasons. Seasons blur into operational years. Human beings stop perceiving themselves inside a story and begin perceiving themselves inside a system. Near the communications tent, radio operators monitor overnight reports arriving through static from weather stations and distant commands across Europe. Front lines shift slowly on the maps pinned inside headquarters tents. Industrial targets change. Strategic priorities evolve. Yet down on the airfield, daily existence remains almost identical despite the movement of history elsewhere. The men stationed here experience the war primarily through continuity rather than progress. One older mechanic studies a newly arrived bomber from America while standing beside the maintenance area during a break in freezing rain. The aircraft still gleams beneath fresh paint untouched by altitude or flak damage. For several moments it appears almost unreal beside the weathered machines surrounding it. Too clean. Too intact. Like something belonging to another emotional world entirely. By spring, it will look like all the others. The machinery transforms everything eventually. You watch replacement crews unloading from transport trucks along the muddy perimeter roads while nearby bombers prepare for departure into cloud and darkness. The cycle no longer shocks anyone. New boys arriving with uncertain expressions. Older crews departing toward targets north of the mountains. Empty cots filled again before the blankets fully cool from the previous occupant. Attrition has become environmental now rather than exceptional. Inside the briefing tents, the atmosphere carries exhaustion deeper than fear. Men study maps while portable stoves glow weakly against damp cold air drifting beneath the canvas flaps. Some crews barely remove gloves during briefings anymore because fingers stiffen too quickly in the freezing mornings. Coffee steams beside target photographs already curling from humidity and repeated handling. One navigator realizes during the weather briefing that he no longer imagines individual cities beneath the routes crossing the maps. Only cloud layers. Fuel timing. Flak zones. Mountain turbulence. Entire populations have disappeared from his operational perception beneath altitude and repetition. The bombing war has abstracted geography into procedural space. Outside, dawn struggles upward through heavy cloud while the bombers taxi toward the runways beneath floodlights reflecting across standing water and ice. The men aboard them no longer stare outward during takeoff as often as they once did. Many close their eyes briefly instead while engines rise toward full power beneath them. Conserving energy. Conserving thought. Conserving emotional motion wherever possible. You sense how deeply the machinery now governs their interior lives. Not through ideology. Not through hatred. Through endless operational recurrence. The human nervous system adapting itself toward industrial rhythm because adaptation remains the only survivable condition. Near the edge of the runway, one crew chief watches the bombers lifting slowly through fog toward invisible sky beyond the cloud ceiling. He realizes suddenly that the airfield no longer requires witnesses emotionally connected to the war in order to continue functioning. Fuel will still arrive. Repairs will still occur. Bombers will still depart before dawn whether the men believe in the larger purpose or not. The machinery has achieved self-sustaining momentum. And beneath another freezing morning spreading across the plains around Foggia, the formations vanish once more into weather while the camp settles back into waiting without surprise, without ceremony, almost without thought at all. Spring arrives cautiously around Foggia, though the men notice it more through altered operational conditions than through beauty itself. Mud begins drying along the maintenance roads after months of rain. Frost disappears from the bomber wings before dawn. Olive groves surrounding the airfields darken gradually with new growth beneath widening sunlight that lingers later into the evening. Yet even these changes feel absorbed immediately into the machinery rather than existing separately from it. Weather matters operationally before emotionally now. You watch the crews adjusting instinctively to the returning warmth. Heavy winter jackets folded away beside the cots. Gloves abandoned more frequently during maintenance work. Briefings conducted with tent flaps partially open to allow fresh air through interiors saturated all winter with damp canvas and cigarette smoke. Bodies adapt automatically because operational life leaves little room for conscious transition between seasons. One mechanic stands beside the runway after sunrise and suddenly realizes he can smell grass again beneath the fuel and oil and hot metal. The realization startles him more than expected. For months the world existed almost entirely through cold machinery and wet canvas and frozen breath beneath floodlights. Now the countryside itself slowly reappears around the airfield as though emerging from beneath the war. Yet the machinery remains unchanged. Bombers still depart before dawn. Formation reports still drift through static-filled radios. Replacement crews still arrive from the south carrying clean uniforms and uncertain expressions. Repetition survives every season. You begin sensing how operational continuity eventually overwhelms historical scale for the men living inside it. Entire offensives shift across Europe. Cities burn. Armies advance and retreat beyond the mountains. But around Foggia, daily existence continues governed primarily by maintenance schedules, weather patterns, and the endless physical requirements of keeping bombers airborne. One navigator studies updated route maps during briefing and notices how targets have gradually moved farther north compared to earlier missions months ago. Yet emotionally, the difference feels strangely minor now. Another city. Another industrial district hidden beyond cloud and altitude. Repetition has flattened geography itself into operational sequence. Outside, morning sunlight spreads across the runways with increasing warmth while bombers prepare for departure beneath skies finally clearing after long winter weather. Mechanics work shirt-sleeved for the first time in weeks. Italian laborists repair drainage trenches damaged by winter flooding near the perimeter roads. Somewhere beyond the olive groves, church bells ring openly now that windows and doors no longer remain sealed against freezing wind. Ordinary seasonal life begins returning to the countryside. The airfield barely notices. One replacement gunner watches swallows moving through the sky above the camp while waiting beside his aircraft before departure. The birds dart effortlessly between hangars and floodlight towers, chasing insects awakened by the warmer air. For a brief moment he feels disconnected from the machinery entirely, watching living movement untouched by operational rhythm. Then the engines start. The sound erases everything else. You watch the bombers lifting once more into widening morning sky while sunlight flashes across patched aluminum surfaces repaired too many times to count. Some aircraft now carry entire sections replaced from other damaged bombers cannibalized during winter. The machines continue surviving through accumulation and reconstruction rather than preservation. So do the men. Inside the camp, the waiting hours unfold beneath brighter afternoons and lengthening shadows. Crews sleep beside open tent flaps while warm wind carries the smell of grass and fuel through the camp roads. Laundry dries faster now. Mud hardens gradually into dust again. The mechanical seasons continue turning. One older pilot sits outside the mess tent during late afternoon and realizes suddenly that he no longer remembers which operational habits originally belonged to him and which were taught by the machinery itself. The cigarette before briefing. the instinctive counting of returning formations, the inability to sleep deeply without engines somewhere nearby. Repetition has merged personal identity with operational environment so thoroughly that separation feels impossible now. Around him, the camp continues moving through familiar rhythms almost independent of individual awareness. Fuel trucks arriving from the south. Replacement parts unloaded beside maintenance sheds. Crews laughing softly during evening meals before tomorrow's departures. Mechanics working beneath floodlights as daylight fades across the plains. The machinery no longer requires emotional investment to sustain itself. Only continuation. Near sunset, several bombers return carrying fresh spring mud splashed across landing gear after emergency landings on damaged auxiliary fields farther north. Ground crews move toward them automatically while swallows continue circling overhead through warm evening air. The contrast feels almost unbearable for a moment. Nature renewing itself beside endless industrial destruction. Yet both continue simultaneously without acknowledging the contradiction. One navigator climbs down from his aircraft after a long mission and pauses beside the runway while evening sunlight settles across the olive groves beyond the camp. The air smells of wet earth and flowering trees for the first time in months. Somewhere nearby, Italian children laugh faintly along a distant road outside the perimeter fences. The sound feels unfamiliar now. Not because it is rare. Because the machinery has gradually replaced ordinary human atmosphere inside him. He stands there listening for several moments before another engine begins testing near the maintenance area and operational sound once again fills the airfield completely. The moment passes. Like winter. Like summer. Like fear. Like grief. Everything around Foggia eventually becomes absorbed into the endless rhythm of departure, waiting, return, repair, and continuation beneath the enormous indifferent sky. The war continues after belief. By the final operational months, many of the men around Foggia no longer speak about victory with much conviction. Not because they expect defeat. Because repetition has worn abstract language smooth through overuse. Words like victory and freedom and strategy drift through briefings and official announcements, yet operational life itself feels governed by something far more immediate and physical. Weather, fuel, fatigue, the vibration of engines through the ground before dawn. Human beings living inside machinery long enough that continuation becomes more real than purpose. You watch the crews gathering before sunrise beneath skies finally clearing more often as spring deepens across southern Italy. Olive trees move softly in warm wind beyond the perimeter roads while bombers stand ready beneath floodlights fading gradually against the approaching dawn. The atmosphere carries none of the sharp tension once visible during earlier months. Fear still exists. Exhaustion still exists. But emotional intensity itself has thinned through repetition until most men move now with restrained calm bordering occasionally on emptiness. One older pilot studies the younger replacements during briefing and realizes suddenly how difficult it has become to explain why the bombing campaign continues emotionally rather than strategically. The machinery has operated so long that justification no longer arrives daily alongside the missions. Operations persist because operations persisted yesterday. Continuation has become self-validating. Inside the briefing tents, maps cover enormous sections of Europe now transformed almost entirely into operational space through repeated exposure. Industrial zones, rail corridors, oil facilities, weather routes crossing mountain systems. The men no longer imagine individual cities beneath the target markings as clearly as they once might have. Altitude and repetition have abstracted geography itself. One navigator catches himself referring to a major European city only by its approach heading and cloud pattern during conversation after briefing. The realization unsettles him briefly. Then the engines begin warming outside and the thought disappears beneath operational rhythm once more. You begin sensing how prolonged mechanized war gradually separates human behavior from emotional certainty. The crews still perform their duties carefully. They still help one another during repairs and difficult landings and freezing altitude. Yet the larger ideological structure surrounding the war feels increasingly distant compared to the immediate physical reality of survival and continuation. Near the maintenance zones, mechanics work beside bombers carrying patches upon patches from previous missions. Entire sections of fuselage replaced. Different shades of aluminum visible along repaired wings. Oil stains darkened permanently into the metal around engine housings. The aircraft themselves now resemble records of accumulated endurance more than symbols of technological strength. So do the men repairing them. One mechanic notices his hands trembling slightly while replacing a fuel line during afternoon maintenance. Not fear. Not cold. Exhaustion settled too deeply into the nervous system after endless operational months. He pauses briefly, watching sunlight reflect across the patched bomber skin beside him, and realizes he no longer remembers what rested muscles once felt like. Around him, the machinery continues without hesitation. Fuel trucks arrive. Engines tested. Replacement parts unloaded. Tomorrow's departures assembled before today's repairs finish. The system survives through momentum now more than intention. You watch the bombers lifting into bright spring sky while swallows move effortlessly between the formations circling above the plains around Foggia. Nature continues renewing itself around the airfields despite everything. Wildflowers spread beside drainage ditches. Grass grows through abandoned shell craters near the perimeter roads. Italian farmers repair vineyard walls damaged during previous fighting while aircraft carrying tons of explosives pass overhead toward northern targets hidden beyond the horizon. The contrast no longer shocks the crews as deeply as before. Repetition has normalized contradiction itself. One replacement radio operator who arrived months earlier now realizes he has unconsciously begun giving operational instructions using the same exhausted tone once carried by the older crews who first trained him. Calm. Economical. Emotionally narrowed toward functionality. The machinery reproduces itself through behavior as much as through supply chains and replacement aircraft. Inside the mess hall during late afternoon, conversations drift toward rumors of shifting front lines farther north. Germany weakening. Rail systems collapsing. Targets reduced to ruins already bombed repeatedly. Yet the operational schedules pinned beside the briefing tents remain largely unchanged. Dawn departures continue. Weather reports continue. Maintenance rosters continue. The machinery does not know how to stop gradually, only how to continue until ordered otherwise. You begin noticing how deeply operational repetition has altered the men's relationship to time itself. Months disappeared not through speed, but through sameness. Dawn after dawn beneath engines and weather reports and waiting. Individual memories flattening beneath continuous recurrence until whole seasons feel compressed into one enormous operational day stretching endlessly across the plains around Foggia. One navigator stands outside his tent after sunset watching floodlights shimmer across the runways while mechanics continue repairs through the warm evening air. Somewhere beyond the olive groves, church bells drift faintly across the countryside alongside distant civilian voices carried by the wind. For several moments he tries imagining ordinary life after the war ends. He cannot do it clearly. The machinery has occupied too much internal space. Around him, bombers stand waiting for another dawn departure beneath floodlights and soft spring darkness. Engines ticking quietly while cooling after today's mission. ground crews moving between them with lanterns and toolboxes. The entire airfield breathing steadily through operational rhythm, older now than many of the men's remaining emotional certainties. And beneath the calm southern night, the bombing war continues forward almost mechanically, long after belief itself has begun fading quietly inside the people sustaining it. The final months bring fewer surprises than the beginning ever did. That realization settles gradually across the airfield one evening while returning bombers descend through warm spring haze above the plains around Foggia. The formations appear smaller now despite their unchanged size. Familiarity has altered scale itself. What once felt enormous and overwhelming has become environmental, absorbed into ordinary expectation through repetition repeated hundreds of times beneath the same sky. You watch the crews climb down from the aircraft carrying helmets and oxygen masks with the weary precision of men completing another industrial shift rather than returning from combat. Ground crews move toward the bombers automatically before engines fully stop turning. Fuel calculations already underway for tomorrow. Repair schedules already forming around fresh damage still visible along the fuselage. The machinery thinks ahead continuously. Human beings struggle simply to remain emotionally present inside it. One tail gunner pauses beside the runway after landing and realizes suddenly he cannot remember the specific details of the mission already ending. Flak somewhere beyond the target. Cloud cover during bomb release. Engine vibration through freezing altitude. The experiences blur together almost immediately now after return, dissolving into the larger operational rhythm surrounding them. Repetition has begun consuming memory itself. Near the maintenance tents, replacement aircraft continue arriving from supply depots farther south while damaged bombers are dismantled nearby for usable parts. Wings removed. Instruments stripped. Engines transferred between airframes. The machinery sustains itself through cannibalization as much as production now. Nothing wasted if continuation remains possible. The men have learned the same lesson unconsciously. Sleep whenever possible. Preserve emotional energy. Avoid unnecessary thought before missions. Continue functioning even when certainty disappears. Operational life teaches endurance through reduction. You begin noticing how the older crews now speak more gently to the newer replacements than earlier generations once spoke to them. Not out of optimism. Out of recognition. They understand now how the machinery changes everyone eventually. The loud confidence of arrival softens into operational calm. Fear compresses inward. Time loses shape beneath repetition. One mechanic watches a newly arrived replacement crew laughing loudly outside the mess tent after dinner and experiences a strange sensation almost like nostalgia, though the memory itself remains uncomfortable. He remembers when the war still felt temporary enough for spontaneous energy. Before operational life narrowed everything toward procedure and survival. The machinery ages human beings unevenly. Outside the perimeter fences, southern Italy moves steadily towards summer again. Grass thickens along the drainage canals beside the runways. Farmers return fully to the fields beyond the camps. Warm evening wind carries the smell of flowering trees through the airfield after sunset. The natural world continues its cycles without regard for strategic bombing or collapsing fronts farther north. Yet the bombers still rise before dawn. Even now, you watch the crews preparing for another mission beneath stars fading slowly into morning light while swallows circle above the floodlights chasing insects disturbed by engine heat. The contrast feels almost unbearable in its quietness. Living things moving effortlessly through air already claimed by machinery and war. One navigator catches himself listening more carefully now to civilian sounds drifting inward from nearby villages during quiet evenings. Church bells. Dogs barking along distant roads. Laughter carried faintly through warm darkness. Months earlier such sounds blended unnoticed into the operational atmosphere surrounding the camps. Now they feel strangely fragile. Reminders that another form of existence still survives beyond maintenance schedules and target routes. Inside the briefing tents, rumors spread increasingly about the war nearing conclusion somewhere beyond the mountains and cloud systems north of the Adriatic. Rail networks collapsing. Fuel shortages inside enemy territory. Entire cities reduced beyond operational value after repeated bombing. Yet the men receive these reports with restrained reaction. Too many mornings have passed beneath the machinery for emotional certainty to return easily now. One pilot realizes during briefing that part of him no longer trusts endings. Operational repetition has conditioned him toward continuation. Even peace feels difficult to imagine procedurally. Outside, dawn arrives warm and clear across the plains around Foggia while bombers taxi toward the runways beneath pale gold light spreading across olive groves and muddy roads hardened finally into dust again. Mechanics stand watching the departures with hands buried inside pockets already stained permanently by oil and fuel. Some of these men have serviced hundreds of missions from the same sections of runway. Some can identify aircraft individually now by engine sound alone. The machinery has become intimate. Not loved. Not admired. Known. You sense how deeply this distinction matters. The men around Foggia no longer experience the bombing war as spectacle or ideology. They experience it physically. Through exhaustion in the joints after endless maintenance shifts. Through oxygen masks freezing against skin at altitude. Through interrupted sleep and vibrating coffee cups before dawn. Through the endless repetition of watching aircraft vanish into cloud and counting how many return by evening. This is what prolonged mechanized war ultimately becomes. Not narrative. Condition. Near midnight, after the final maintenance crews finish repairs beneath floodlights shimmering across the warm spring darkness, one older navigator walks slowly toward the runway edge alone. The airfield lies quieter now between operational cycles. Engines silent for the moment. Trucks parked motionless beside fuel depots. Bombers standing beneath the stars waiting for another morning. He realizes suddenly that the machinery surrounding him will likely outlive every emotional certainty the men once carried into it. Fear faded. Belief faded. Excitement faded. Even grief changed shape beneath repetition. But the operational rhythm endured. Departure. Waiting. Return. Repair. Continuation. And beneath the vast indifferent southern sky above Foggia, the bombers stand quietly in the darkness like monuments not to victory or strategy, but to the terrifying human ability to adapt almost completely to endless mechanized repetition. Aftermath. The runways around Foggia still exist beneath the sun. Grass pushes slowly through sections of cracked steel matting left buried beneath soil and weather after the machinery finally quieted. Olive trees continue moving in the warm southern wind beside roads once crowded endlessly with fuel convoys and replacement crews. Birds cross the same sky where bomber formations once assembled before dawn in numbers large enough to darken entire stretches of countryside beneath their shadows. The noise disappeared gradually after the war. Not all at once. A few fewer engines each week. Fewer floodlights burning through the night. Fewer convoys arriving from the ports. Empty tents collapsing inward beneath rain and sunlight after the crews departed north or home or toward entirely different lives. Yet for many of the men who lived beside the airfields, silence itself no longer felt entirely natural afterward. You can imagine one of them decades later standing beside an ordinary road somewhere far from Italy while hearing an aircraft pass overhead unexpectedly through clouds. For a brief instant, the body remembers before the mind does. Muscles tighten slightly. Attention lifts automatically toward the sound. Somewhere deep beneath memory, repetition still survives. Because the machinery around Foggia did not shape the men only through danger. It shaped perception itself. The war reorganized time into operational cycles. Reorganized geography into routes and targets. Reorganized emotion into manageable routines capable of surviving endless continuation. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it revealed how adaptable human beings become once repetition lasts long enough. The boys who arrived staring openly at the bombers eventually stopped hearing the engines consciously. The crews who once counted every mission eventually lost track of individual flights beneath operational sameness. Fear remained, but changed texture. Grief remained, but softened into quiet procedural absence. Even belief itself faded gradually beneath the physical demands of continuation. Still the machinery continued. That may be the deepest echo left behind by places like Foggia. Not merely destruction. Not merely strategic bombing. But the realization that industrial war could absorb ordinary human life so completely that extraordinary conditions eventually became environmental. Daily. Familiar. The plains of southern Italy remember this differently now. Warm wind still moves across the olive groves in late afternoon exactly as it did during the long operational summers. Rain still gathers along drainage canals near abandoned runway edges. Church bells still drift softly through villages rebuilt beside fields once occupied by fuel depots and maintenance tents and endless temporary camps. Nature resumed its rhythms patiently after the machinery stopped. Nature always does. Yet somewhere beneath the grass and repaired roads and quiet countryside, the memory remains layered into the landscape itself. Young men drinking weak coffee before dawn beneath floodlights. Mechanics working through freezing rain beside damaged bombers. Crews counting returning formations against cloud-filled skies while trying not to notice the empty places inside them. You can almost hear the engines if you stand there long enough in imagination. Not loudly now. Only distantly. A vibration beneath memory more than sound. And perhaps that is what places like Foggia ultimately leave behind after the machinery falls silent. Not heroism alone. Not victory alone. But a quieter and more difficult truth about human endurance. That people can survive almost anything if repetition teaches them how. Even endless waiting. Even exhaustion. Even mechanized skies where continuation matters more than certainty. The bombers rose. The bombers returned. Sometimes they did not. The seasons turned around them regardless. Summer dust. Winter frost. Spring rain falling softly across the runways after midnight while floodlights reflected in standing water beside aircraft waiting for dawn. And now the plains rest quietly again beneath southern sunlight and drifting birds and ordinary weather untouched by war. But the echoes remain. Soft. Mechanical. Endlessly recurring somewhere beyond sight. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.